Good evening, and welcome back, wherever you are in the world right now, in a quiet bedroom, on a long bus ride, or lying on the sofa with the lights turned low. Thank you for letting this gentle little corner of history keep you company tonight. Take a moment to get comfortable. You might like to lie on your back, or curl up on your side, or just let your head sink a little deeper into the pillow. If it feels good, let your shoulders soften, unclench your jaw, and allow your eyes to grow a little heavier with every breath. Because tonight, we're going to wander slowly into one of those stories that almost everyone has heard of, but very few people have ever really followed all the way through. This is the long, drifting story of King Arthur and Camelot, not just as shining pictures in a book, but as a tangle of memories, half-forgotten battles, monks with ink-stained fingers, ruined hillsides, and modern archaeologists with muddy boots. You've probably met little fragments of this legend already. A sword in a stone, a king with a bright blade called Excalibur, a round table where no one is supposed to sit above anyone else, a queen, a knight, and a love that begins as something noble and ends in heartbreak. But under those familiar images, there are questions that don't quite go away. Was there ever a real leader behind the name Arthur, some warlord, standing on a wet British hillside while the old Roman world fell apart around him? Was there once a great hall not necessarily made of white marble and golden towers, but a timber hall on a windy hill somewhere, where real people ate bread, sharpened swords, and listened to stories that would, centuries later, become Camelot? How much of this legend is history? How much is memory, stretched and embroidered over time? And how much is the wild, brilliant work of imagination, passed in low voices from one fire to the next until it became something bigger than any single person? Tonight, we're not going to rush toward an answer. This is not a quiz. This is a long, slow walk through the mist, following the places where history and story overlap. We'll drift from the last days of Roman Britain to early angry sermons that never quite say Arthur's name, to monks who decide to make their own kings a little grander, to French poets who turn a rough war leader into the center of a glittering court, to modern archaeologists opening trenches on green hills that local people still call Arthur's Place. All of that, and more, is waiting for us, but there's no need to stay awake for every detail. This video is here to keep watch while you fall asleep. You can let the names and dates and places wash past you like the sound of distant rain. If you drift away in the middle of a sentence, that's not a problem, that's the whole idea. Before we begin this journey properly, I'd love to know, as always, where in the world are you listening from tonight? If you feel like it tomorrow, when you wake up, you can leave a comment and tell me the country, or the city, or just from my tiny room with the blue lamp. It is still quietly astonishing to see messages from so many different places gathering under one sleepy video. And if these long, gentle dives into the past help you relax, you can support the channel in a very simple way. By subscribing, by tapping the like button, or by sharing this with someone else who struggles to switch off at night. You don't have to, of course, you are welcome here. Whether you're a regular who drifts off to every upload, or you've just found this video by accident while scrolling in the dark. For now, all you really need to do is breathe. In and out. Let the day loosen its grip on you. The messages, the notifications, the to-do lists, they can all wait on the far side of sleep. We're going to step together into an older kind of noise. The clink of armor, the murmur of prayer in a half-ruined church, the wind over a lonely hill fort, the scratch of a quill as a monk writes a name that will echo for centuries. So, if you'd like, close your eyes now, let the room around you fade a little, and allow the ancient world to unfold. Tonight we're talking about King Arthur, the man who may, or may not, have stood behind the legend, and about Camelot, the shining city that might never have existed in stone at all, and yet somehow still lives in our minds. Let's begin our walk. Imagine, if you can, that the night around your bed is not a bedroom at all anymore, but a wide, dim shoreline at the far edge of the Roman Empire. For hundreds of years, soldiers from distant provinces have marched along stone roads through this land. They've built forts and tiled villas with underfloor heating and bathhouses where steam curls up from warm water. Latin voices have echoed in marketplaces. Coins with emperors' faces have passed from hand to hand. Now, very slowly at first, and then all at once, that world begins to loosen and slip away. You can picture an old Roman wall in the north, stretching across hills and moorland. Once, it bristled with life. Guards on watchtowers, fires in the barracks, orders shouted in clipped Latin. Over time, the garrison shrinks. Pay arrives late or not at all. Tiles crack. Weeds push between the stones. One day, a soldier looking out from the parapet realizes that he has no idea when the next courier will come from the south, or if it will ever come again. Far away on the continent, emperors are being made and unmade faster than anyone here can remember. There are invasions, rebellions, and desperate defenses. The great imperial machine is trying to put out too many fires at once, and out here, on what must have felt like the edge of the world, orders become suggestions. Suggestions become echoes. Then, finally, silence. At some point, not with a neat date on a calendar, but with 1,000 small changes, the regular shipments of pay stop. The soldiers on the frontier have to fend for themselves or go home. The administrators pack up their scrolls or are simply gone. The stone roads are still there. The towns still stand. The baths still hold water. But the hand that held everything together has let go. This is the Britain into which any real Arthur, if he ever existed, would have stepped. Not the polished, banner-filled Camelot of later paintings, but a thinner, more uncertain world. A landscape of half-ruined Roman buildings, shrinking towns, and local strongmen trying to decide whether they are still part of an empire or something else entirely. If you walked through one of those towns, you might notice the small signs of change first. A villa whose beautiful mosaic floor has been partly broken up and patched with rough stone. A bathhouse with cold water in the pool but no more hot steam. A temple courtyard where the statues stand, but the priests have left, and sheep sometimes wander in to graze on the grass between fallen columns. Out in the countryside, old Roman farmsteads are being taken over by local families who may not care about tiled roofs and painted walls as long as the fields can still be worked. Some people in this Britain still speak forms of Latin, especially the churchmen and anyone who dealt with Roman officials. Others speak the old native tongues, Celtic languages that will eventually grow into Welsh and Cornish and Breton. Different voices, different memories, overlapping on the same damp ground. Now, imagine that you are standing on a low hill, looking east. Beyond the forests and marshes, new ships are beginning to nose across the narrow sea. They are not Roman warships with neat rows of oars, but smaller craft, sometimes no more than long boats with a spray of shields along the side. The people who step down from those boats speak different languages again, harsh to British ears. Early Germanic tongues that will one day become English. We give them names now: Angles, Saxons, Jutes. But to the people watching from the shore, they are simply newcomers with unfamiliar gods, unfamiliar weapons, and unfamiliar ambitions. Some local rulers see an opportunity. If you have enemies in the next valley, if your cousins have been trying to take your land, if your neighbors won't pay the tribute you think they owe, then hiring tough warriors from across the sea can sound like a very practical idea. Come and fight for me, you might say. I will give you gold and land if you stand on my side. So in some places, these newcomers are welcomed as mercenaries, guards, helpers. In other places, or a little later, the story looks very different. The same men, or their brothers and sons, start to carve out their own territories. More boats arrive. Farms are burned. Churches are looted. Fields are taken. To the native Britons, this wave of arrivals must have felt deeply confusing. Were these people employees, guests, invaders, all three at once? It is in this messy, shifting time that we catch our first faint glimpse of something that might be a real Arthur. If you imagine the story of Britain as a long, handwritten scroll, most of the lines from this period have faded. A few sentences remain in the margins, in angry sermons, in short chronicles scratched on parchment by monks who cared more about moral lessons than military detail. One of those monks is a man we know as Gildas. He lives probably in the 6th century, in a world that still remembers the Roman order and the chaos that followed. He sits down, perhaps in a cold stone room with a small window and a smoking lamp, and writes a long, fierce text, complaining about the sins of the British rulers of his day. Gildas is not really interested in writing history the way we think of it now. He wants to warn, to scold, to say, look what happened when we turned away from God. Look at the disasters that fell on us. But in the middle of this sermon, he lets slip certain details that catch our attention. He talks about a time of terrible raids and suffering, when foreign enemies pushed deep into the land. And he mentions a great battle at a place he calls something like Bedtime, where the Britons somehow held the line, where, against expectation, the advance was stopped and driven back for a while. To us, reading much later, this sounds like a turning point, a day when someone, somewhere, organized enough resistance to make the newcomers falter. Gildas praises the victory. He praises the generation that fought. He says that from that battle came a kind of breathing space, a pause in the worst of the suffering. And yet, as you lie here listening, imagine running your finger along the line of his text, looking for one crucial thing, the name of the commander, and finding nothing. He never tells us who led the Britons at Badon. All that effort, all that blood, all that memory, and not a single name. That silence is like a missing tooth you cannot quite stop touching with your tongue. You know something should be there. You can feel the gap. It nags at you. Later, other writers cannot leave the gap alone. A few centuries pass. The language shifts again. Somewhere in the borderlands between what we now call Wales, Cornwall, and Western Britain, another cleric sits down with parchment and ink. He compiles what will later be known as a history of the Britons. In reality, it's a weave of scripture, legend, local tales, and whatever scraps of older records he can find. When he comes to the wars against the Saxons, he does something that Gildas did not. He gives us a name. He lists a series of battles, some with place names we recognize, many with names that are ghosts to us now, and he says that these victories were won under a leader called Arthur. He does not call him king. He uses a Latin phrase closer to commander of battles, a kind of war leader, a general, someone who stands at the front in times of crisis. Arthur, he says, fought 12 great battles, the last of them at Badon. Just like that, the blank space in Gildas's story is filled. You can almost hear the click of it. Here is the missing name. Here is the champion whose memory hung in the air. Here is the man, or the figure, onto whom so many fears and hopes can be pinned. And yet, even in this moment, you can feel the strange double nature of what's happening. On one side, it seems entirely plausible that there really was a gifted war leader. In this period, someone who managed to pull together scattered British forces, ride quickly along old Roman roads, and choose battlefields where the newcomers would struggle. On the other side, you can see the storyteller at work. The chronicler cannot resist adding a flourish. In one battle, he says, Arthur killed hundreds of enemies single-handedly in a single charge, a number so large that any modern reader smiles or raises an eyebrow. It's a detail that tells you two things at once. First, that they remembered him as a champion, a figure bigger than other men. And second, that they were not shy about exaggeration. If you focus your mind for a moment on that 5th or early 6th century landscape, the time in which this commander might have lived, it looks nothing like the later polished Camelot. It is rougher, more broken. Roman towns still stand, but many are half empty, or patched with timber instead of fine stone. The baths might be cold, the statues chipped, Some quarters are abandoned to rats and ivy. Between these towns, the roads are still there, but less carefully maintained. Where once work crews would repair every crack, now grass sprouts between the stones. Bridges rot. Trees lean closer. On the hilltops and along river valleys, local chieftains set themselves up in old forts and new strongholds. Some keep using Roman-style cloaks and swords, partly because they are useful, partly because they still carry a sense of rank. Across the eastern lands, settlements with Anglo-Saxon-style houses are growing. Wooden halls with thatched roofs, cemeteries with different burial customs, new gods carried in from across the sea. Sometimes there is trade and uneasy coexistence. Sometimes there is war. If you imagine standing on a ridge in that world, looking out across a patchwork of fields and forest and marsh, you can understand how a single strong commander, someone who could knit together different British groups for even a few seasons, would have seemed almost miraculous. He would not have worn shining plate armor. That belongs to later centuries. He might have had a good horse, a well-made sword, some chainmail if he was wealthy or well-connected, but a lot of his kit would have been practical, not picturesque. He would have needed more than raw courage, an understanding of how to move quickly, how to rally scattered communities, how to choose positions on hills and ridges, how to use memories of Roman discipline with local knowledge of the land. We do not know where this Arthur, if he existed, was born. We do not know his face. Later, the poets will drape him in brilliance, golden banners, dragons on shields, swords that shine. But under all that, if there ever was a real man, his life would have been hard. Mud and rain, hungry winters, long rides, wounds that never quite healed. Instead of a clear biography, we have echoes, soft, scattered echoes. Early Welsh poems speak of a leader whose name sometimes looks like Arthur and sometimes like older shapes of it. In these verses, he is the standard by which other warriors are measured. A poet might say that a certain fighter was no worse than Arthur, as if that is the highest praise he can think of. Place names, too, begin to collect his shadow. In different corners of Wales, Cornwall, the north of Britain, people point at a stone, a ridge, a pool, and say, Arthur fought here. Arthur threw this rock. Arthur's men sleep under that hill. Some of these stories are almost certainly later inventions. People love to attach grand tales to strange stones and lonely earthworks. It is a way of making sense of the landscape, of stitching memory into it. But the sheer number of such places hints at something deeper. For the Celtic-speaking peoples of Britain, Arthur is not just a character in a single tale. He is more like a cloud of stories, a figure threaded through many different local memories. You can think of it like the way people talk about a legendary musician or a famous athlete today. Every town says, "Oh, they played here once. My cousin saw them at a tiny venue before they were famous. That bar was where they wrote their best song." The tales pile up, blur, move from place to place, always with the same name at the center. Something like that seems to have happened with Arthur. And above all this, shaping what survives and what does not, sits the church. The men who could write the ones with access to parchment and ink and time were almost all clerics. Monks in small communities, priests attached to noble courts, bishops who traveled between strongholds. They had their own priorities. They cared about sin and punishment, about the rise and fall of kings as examples of pride or humility. They cared about showing that God was in control of history, rewarding good rulers, chastising bad ones. If you were such a monk in Western Britain or Wales, surrounded by Saxon kingdoms that claimed to be the future, you might feel a sharp need for stories that said, "We too had our moment of strength. We too had a champion." When you looked back at that gap in Gildas's sermon, that unnamed victor at Badon, it would be very tempting to fill it. Perhaps there had been a leader with a name like Arthur. Perhaps there had been several commanders, years apart, whose deeds blurred together when you heard the old folks talk by the fire. Perhaps older Celtic heroes from longer ago tales had already carried that name or something like it. You might pull those threads together and knot them into one figure, one shining, complicated champion who embodies the age when your people did not simply suffer invasion, but stood and fought back. That is one way to imagine how the shadow of Arthur on the page grew darker, clearer, more solid over time. From a missing name, to a brief mention as leader of battles, to poems where he becomes the measure of bravery, to tales where he is less a person than a symbol of an entire age. If you find yourself drifting, that's perfectly all right. You can let the names Gildas, Bedtime, early Welsh poets blur softly. What matters for your sleepy mind is the feeling of it. A land that has lost its empire, but not its memory of resistance. A gap in an old text that cries out to be filled. A figure rising slowly from misty half-remembrance into story. That figure is not yet the crowned king in a perfect hall called Camelot. Not yet. Right now, he is still a war leader in a rough world. It is only later, in quieter rooms, in courts where French rather than Latin is spoken, that another layer of the legend will be added. The layer that turns this hard-edged commander into the center of a glittering, courtly universe. When you are ready, we'll wander there next. For now, you can rest in this twilight between empire and early kingdoms, where Arthur is still more echo than statue. If you'd like me to carry on into the next part, where monks and poets begin to dress this shadow in a crown, a court, and finally a place called Camelot, just tell me. If you imagine that first, half-glimpsed Arthur the rough commander in a crumbling post-Roman Britain as a figure speaking by the fire, then the next big change in his story doesn't happen on a battlefield at all. It happens on parchment. The world around him has shifted again. Some of the old British kingdoms have faded. Across much of England, the language of the ruling class is now French, brought in by conquerors from across the Channel. Stone keeps rise over rivers, new abbeys, flower. In the corner of a cloister, or in a quiet study at a bishop's house, a clerk dips a quill into ink and decides to write a grand history of the kings of Britain. His name is Geoffrey of Monmouth. He writes in Latin, the language of educated churchmen, the language of authority. His audience is not villagers in smoky halls, but people who can read or have texts read aloud to them. Monks, bishops, nobles who want to hear flattering tales about the land they rule. If you imagined him at work, you might see a desk piled with earlier texts, that fiery sermon of Gildas, some lists of kings, some half-remembered prophecies, maybe a few scraps of old stories heard from Welsh visitors. Geoffrey does something bold. He stretches out his hand into that murky mix of memory and legend and pulls Arthur forward, sets him in the very center of his long tale. Arthur, in Geoffrey's version, is no longer just a leader of battles on the margins. He becomes a conqueror. He defeats Saxon enemies, yes, but also fights campaigns beyond Britain's shores. He glitters with the kind of splendor that would not have felt out of place in the courts of Geoffrey's own day. The king now has a family, a succession, advisors, traitors. Prophecies swirl around him, many of them tied to a mysterious seer called Merlin, a figure Geoffrey helps to weave into the story so tightly that later centuries can hardly imagine Arthur without his wizard. Geoffrey names, places, but the court he describes most often is not yet Camelot. He favours a real Roman site we know as Caerleon, on the river Usk in Wales. In Geoffrey's time, its old amphitheatre and walls still stood, overgrown but impressive. If you walked among those ruins in the 12th century, it would be easy to look at the broken arches and imagine them full of kings and nobles, feasts and parades. Geoffrey does something like that in his writing. He takes the bones of a real Roman town and clothes them with Arthur's imagined court. Even here, you can feel the two threads twining. On one side, scraps of older tradition about a war leader who fought Saxons. On the other, the needs and tastes of Geoffrey's own audience. People who like stories of grand kings, sweeping campaigns, and noble councils. For Geoffrey's readers, Arthur is no longer a half-shadow in an angry sermon. He is a heroic king among many others in a sweeping national myth. But there is another current flowing at the same time, one that will add new colors and patterns to this figure. To follow it, you step in your imagination across the sea. After the Norman conquest, the language of power in much of Britain is French. In castles and great houses, in the long winter evenings, people gather to listen to a different kind of story. Not sermons, not chronicles, but romances. These are tales of adventure and love, written in verse that can be recited aloud. They are full of knights, quests, enchantments, and complicated emotions. Their audience is mixed. Lords and ladies, yes, but also the household around them, younger knights, attendants, anyone allowed into the hall while the poet performs. One of the most important of these poets is a man we know as Chrétien de Troyes. He lives and writes in the later 12th century, probably attached to noble courts in what is now France. His patrons enjoy intricate stories about love and honor, told with wit and elegance. Chrétien takes up the Arthurian material and twists the lens. Arthur is still there, but he is no longer the star of the show. Instead, Arthur's court becomes a fixed point in the background, a kind of shining base camp. Individual knights step forward into the light. Eric, who must balance love and fame. Yvain, whose pride and mistakes nearly ruin him. Lancelot, whose devotion to the queen will become one of the most famous and troubling threads in the whole tapestry. Percival, whose simplicity hides a strange, fated role. You can imagine the opening of one of these romances being performed in a crowded hall, the poet's voice rising and falling, the listeners settling in as he names Arthur's court almost like a stage direction. The king was holding a great feast. The knights were gathered at court. It's in one of these French romances that a particular name quietly appears on the page for the first time that we can see. Camelot. Chrétien does not pause to explain it. He does not tell us which river runs past its walls or whether the sea can be heard from its gates. He doesn't trace the road from any real town. He simply drops the name into his verse, as if his audience already recognizes it as a place of splendor. For him, Camelot is less a plotted dot on a map, and more a kind of narrative shorthand. Say, Camelot, and you have told your listeners that we are now in the heart of Arthur's realm, a hall full of banners and polished armor, glittering ladies and renowned knights, a ceremonial center, a place of tournaments and feasts, from which people ride out into wilder, stranger spaces. We don't know exactly where Chrétien found the name. Maybe it was already floating in oral tales. Maybe he adapted some older word. Maybe he simply coined something that sounded right. What matters is how he uses it. Camelot, in these early mentions, is almost like a theater backdrop, not yet deeply described, but always implied to be marvelous, ordered, and bright. At roughly the same time, another writer is working with Geoffrey of Monmouth's Latin chronicle. His name is Wace, a poet of Norman background. He takes Geoffrey's long Latin prose and turns it into a French verse narrative, reshaping it for the tastes of his own audience. Wace adds one particularly powerful image. He tells us that Arthur, tired of watching his noblemen squabble about who should sit closest to him at feasts, orders a new table to be made, round instead of long. At this table, in theory, no one can claim the highest place. There is no narrow top where the king sits above a line of lesser lords. There is only a circle, where knights are equal when they take their seats. In a world obsessed with rank and privilege, this is a startling idea. Of course, we know that in reality, pride and jealousy do not dissolve just because a carpenter made a wooden circle. But as an image, it is potent. The Round Table says, in effect, that what matters at Arthur's court is not birth alone, but courage, loyalty, and virtue. Now imagine that round table placed in your mind's eye, inside the nameless, shining hall that Chrétien calls Camelot. You can see how the story is being furnished. Geoffrey provides the Grand King and his campaigns. Wace offers the Round Table with its promise of equal honor, Chrétien and other French poets fill the seats with vividly drawn knights and ladies. They are not trying to write sober history. They are playing with themes that matter deeply to their listeners: loyalty, desire, bravery, betrayal, and they are using Arthur's court as the perfect stage on which to act those themes out. If you walked into one of those noble halls while a romance was being recited, you would see people listening not just for the fights and marvels, but for the emotional knots: the knight who loves beyond what honor allows, the king who tries to be just in an unjust world, the lady who must choose between duty and desire. Camelot, in that setting, is less a specific city and more a dream of how power ought to look: clean, brave, ordered, a place where, at least for the length of a story, the strong protect the weak, and oaths mean something. Meanwhile, in the Celtic lands, other storytellers are doing something slightly different with Arthur. In Welsh prose, tales and triads, collections of three-part sayings and memories, Arthur appears in wilder shapes. Sometimes he is a hunter chasing a supernatural boar through otherworldly landscapes. Sometimes he visits enchanted fortresses, or travels with companions who feel closer to old gods than to Christian knights. Those older Welsh materials do not seem to know Camelot as a name. They have their own halls and courts, their own strange geography, half in this world and half in another. When you place all of these strands side by side, Geoffrey's conquering king at Caerleon, the Welsh otherworld visitor, the French poet's elegant Arthur presiding at Camelot over a round table, you begin to see just how layered the legend has already become by the 12th century. It is not one solid story. It is a cluster of stories that overlap and diverge, all using the same name, all pulling on similar feelings. The scribes who copy these tales into manuscripts add yet another texture. You can picture a thick, cream-colored page, the opening letter of Arthur, painted tall, with gold leaf and curling vines. In the margins, tiny knights ride along the stems of painted plants. Strange beasts peep out from behind initials. Colored inks turn scenes of tournaments and councils into jewel-like miniatures. For someone in that world, opening a manuscript of Arthurian romances must have felt a little like opening a doorway. Stare at the page long enough, and you are no longer in a drafty monastic library. You are in a bright hall, hearing the clatter of cups, the murmur of voices, the announcement that some new knight has arrived with a challenge or a tale of adventures in the forest. If you listen closely to the tone of these early romances, though, you notice something interesting. Arthur himself is often a little distant. He appears at the beginning and end of stories, at moments of judgment or celebration. He gives permission for quests. He welcomes returning heroes. He presides over feasts, but the true heart of the action is usually elsewhere, on forest paths, in lonely chapels, at strange castles, far from the safety of the court itself, Camelot, or Caerleon, or Carduel, depending on the poet, is often presented as almost too perfect, a place of order at the center of a ring of chaos. That distance gives the writers room to play a subtle game. They can keep Arthur's court shining and upright, a kind of ideal, while sending their knights into situations where the rules become much harder to follow. Then, in later tales, they can let the cracks that begin in those outer adventures creep inward until the court itself breaks. But for now, in this stretch of the legend, Camelot is still mostly a promise. Say the word, and you summon a hall where the torches are always lit, the banners always hang straight, and justice is always at least attempted. Outside that hall, forests and wild moors and enemy lands spread out like a dark sea, into which bright boats the knights venture and from which they hopefully return. If your eyes are heavy, you can let these layers stack gently in your imagination without trying to pin them down. A war leader in a harsh, post-Roman landscape. A king in a Latin history, with too many victories to be entirely believable. A court full of knights and ladies in French romances. tied together by a round table and a name, Camelot, that hangs over the scene like a painted banner. Scribes copying all this out by candlelight, their handwriting looping, their margins filled with tiny horses and dragons. Listeners sitting on benches, shivering a little not from cold but from recognition as they hear their own struggles dressed up in the armor of Arthur's companions. We have not yet stepped deep inside that hall, to sit at the round table and watch these knights wrestle with the impossible code we call chivalry. That is the next part of the journey. For the moment, as you lie here, you might imagine the doors of Camelot just beginning to open, light spilling out into the dusk, the sound of music and voices drifting onto the road. In the distance, hooves ring on stone as a tired young knight rides toward the glow, hoping to be welcomed, tested, and changed. If you would like to follow him inside to sit at that round table, to meet Gawain, Lancelot, Galahad, and the others, and to see how the shining ideals of Camelot are lived and strained by real human hearts, just tell me. When most people close their eyes and think of Camelot, they don't start with muddy boots or smoky kitchens. They see a wide stone hall lit by fire and sunlight. They picture tall, carved pillars, colored banners hanging high above, maybe a glimpse of a river glittering through an open doorway. There is a ring of chairs, polished smooth by years of use, and at the center of everything, a great round table like the calm eye of a storm. In that mental picture, everything is always clean. The armor gleams, the floors shine, the faces around the table are noble and composed, as if no one ever gets tired, or hungry, or unsure. But if you step a little closer in your imagination, if you let yourself walk quietly across those stone flags and take a seat on one of the benches along the wall, the scene becomes more human. You start to notice that the perfection is held together by effort. The knights who gather at that round table are not symbols carved from stone. They are people, each with their own fears, habits, and tangled loyalties. The code they have sworn to follow sounds simple when you say it quickly. A knight should be brave in battle and gentle with those who cannot defend themselves. He should be loyal to his lord, but mindful of his God. He should keep his word, respect his companions, protect the weak, and bear himself with courtesy, even in the middle of hardship. All of that sounds beautiful when you're hearing it spoken in a clear voice during a ceremony. It sounds even more beautiful set inside a legend, with music in the background and the glow of torches on polished shields. But imagine trying to live by those rules every day, in a world that is still full of hunger, disease, quarrels over land, and very real danger on the roads. You can feel the strain that would put on anyone's heart. Think of a young knight arriving at Camelot for the first time. He has grown up hearing stories about this place. Maybe in his parents' rough hall, someone once passed through who claimed to have seen it. A traveling pilgrim, or a wounded fighter on his way home from another king's war. They described a court where justice was fair, and the greatest warriors sat at a table where no one was placed beneath another. So the young man has ridden miles to get here. His cloak is dusty, his horse is tired, his armor is not yet finely made. It rattles a little when he moves. He smells of sweat, leather, and the smoke of the inns where he slept on the way. He leads his horse through the outer gate and into the courtyard. Around him, grooms lead sleek, well-fed animals to and fro. Squires laugh and jostle, practicing with blunted swords. Someone is carrying baskets of bread toward the kitchens. There is the smell of hay, and steel, and cooking, and the faint hint of incense from the small chapel just off the main yard. Ahead, the doors of the great hall are open. From inside, a soft roar of sound reaches him, the murmur of many voices, a snatch of a harp, the rise and fall of a storyteller's cadence. Firelight flickers on the stone threshold. When he is brought before Arthur, the king is not a painted icon, but a man sitting in a high-backed chair, perhaps with a grey thread or two in his hair now, perhaps with a scar along one cheek. At his side, there is a sword whose name the young knight already knows from tales. In some versions of the legend, Arthur drew that blade from a stone, proving his right to rule. In others, a mysterious hand rose from a lake to offer it to him. However you tell the tale, the sword has become less an object and more a sign, a mark that this man is not just another lord. The young knight kneels. A hush falls around the hall, or at least a soft quiet in his immediate circle. He is asked to swear certain things, to defend those who cannot defend themselves, to keep his promises, even when it hurts, to speak truth as far as he can see it, to be loyal to this king and this court, not only when times are easy and banners fly, but when standing by them may cost him blood or reputation. Perhaps he feels a tremor in his hands as he speaks the words. The sword touches each shoulder in turn. A cup will be raised. Voices will welcome him. Someone might clap him on the back. For a moment, he may feel that he has stepped out of the small, tangled world he knew into a clear, shining rulebook, where right and wrong are obvious, where the good are rewarded and the wicked are punished. That sensation, that sudden sense of stepping into a cleaner story, is part of what Camelot is, not only for the knights inside the legend, but for the listeners hearing about them centuries later. The Round Table sits at the center of that feeling. In most courts, you could tell someone's importance by how far they were from the lord's seat at the high end of a long table. Faces in the dim distance were lesser. Faces close to the head were powerful. At Arthur's court, the storytellers say, this problem is smoothed away by design. The table is a circle. There is no narrow head. Anywhere you sit, you are equidistant from the center. In practice, of course, people will still know who is revered, who is feared, and who is quietly overlooked. Human pride does not vanish just because the furniture is symbolic, but the symbol matters. Every time a quarrel breaks out, every time jealousy flares, that wooden circle stands in the middle of it all like a mirror, reminding everyone present of the promise they are supposed to live up to. Around that circle, the storytellers seat certain figures again and again, until their names feel almost inevitable. There is Gawain, often described in early stories as the model of courtesy and physical strength, the kind of person who can fight from sunrise to noon, and still have the patience to listen at dinner. When a strange challenger comes to court at New Year, offering a terrifying bargain, Gawain is the one who steps forward to accept it in Arthur's place. You might have heard that tale in some form, the story where a knight agrees to strike and then receive a blow a year later from an uncanny green adversary. Beneath the surface-level magic of it, the color, the supernatural resilience, lies something more tender, a man wrestling with his own fear and his desire to be as honorable as everyone believes he is. Then there is Lancelot. He does not appear in the very oldest layers of the legend, but once he arrives in the French romances, he quickly becomes the brightest, sharpest blade in the box. He is the best fighter in the world, the knight whose name alone is supposed to make enemies think twice. His loyalty to Arthur in public is absolute. He wins tournaments for the king, rescues those in danger, and often shows more gentleness to the weak than many others. And yet, by the time later writers are done with him, he carries a wound that no physical weapon can cause. He loves the queen, Guinevere, sitting beside Arthur as his wife and partner in rule, is not just a decorative figure in these tales. She is the social heart of the court, the one whose approval or displeasure can raise or lower reputations. She is wise, sometimes sharp, sometimes vulnerable. Lancelot's devotion to her begins in some stories almost as a religious thing, pure admiration, a service that is supposed to remain within the bounds of a courtly game. In others, it deepens into something neither of them can control. They begin to move from polite glances to secret meetings, from words meant for everyone's ears to words that can't be spoken in the bright circle of the hall at all. The code that governs Camelot says that a knight's loyalty to his king must be unquestioned. It also says that he must serve his chosen lady with his whole heart. For Lancelot, those two loyalties point in opposite directions. You can imagine him sitting at the round table, the light from the fire picking out the dents in his armor, listening to speeches about unity and justice, while his own chest feels like a battlefront. He would like to be simple, brave, loyal, pure. But inside him, two promises pull at each other until something has to give. At the far end of the spectrum from Lancelot sits Galahad, where Lancelot is torn and intensely human. Galahad is almost too clear to look at. In many tellings, he is Lancelot's son, conceived under circumstances that are already tangled with deception and regret. Yet the boy himself grows into a kind of walking symbol of purity. He is the one who will ultimately succeed in the greatest spiritual test that ever comes to Arthur's court, the quest of the Holy Grail. When Galahad sits at the round table, he feels almost less like another knight and more like a bright flame placed there for everyone else to measure themselves against. He does not stay in the story long. He is too rarefied to live comfortably in the ordinary world of politics and compromise. He sees what others cannot see, and then passes beyond the reach of the court, leaving behind a sense of both awe and emptiness. Between these sharp points, Gawain's courtesy, Lancelot's divided heart, Galahad's unreachable purity, the stories set dozens of other figures. There is Percival, sometimes portrayed as naive to the point of foolishness, whose blunders almost ruin the Grail quest, and whose slow, painful learning becomes a kind of parable about how innocence and ignorance are not the same thing. There is Tristan, connected in some versions to Arthur's court, whose love for Isolde is triggered by a potion and then runs wild, echoing and darkening the theme of forbidden love that Lancelot and Guinevere embody in a different way. There are quieter names, too, who fill out the benches, knights who rarely get the spotlight, but whose presence makes the court feel full, like background figures in a painting, faces in the crowd, with their own small victories and disappointments. The life of Camelot is not all quests and prophecies. There are tournaments, semi-playful battles, where knights ride out in coloured surcoats, lances blunted, to test their skill before an audience of nobles watching from stands. The ground shakes with hooves. Crowds cheer when someone unhorses a particularly admired opponent. For the younger men, these spectacles are a chance to shine, to prove themselves, to catch the eye of a lady or the approval of the king. For the veterans who have seen real war, the line between game and reality can feel thin. They know how quickly a festive clash can turn serious if a blow goes wrong, or if an old grudge flares. Between such events, there are quieter rhythms, dawn prayers in the chapel, where armor-clad figures kneel on stone and listen to Latin words they may only half understand, but whose cadence they find reassuring. Meals in the hall, where the seating arrangements and the way dishes are passed carry whole layers of unspoken meaning. A man's place at table is a sign of favor or disfavor. A small shift to the side can speak volumes. Private conversations in corridors or gardens, where alliances are made or doubts voiced. The code of chivalry insists on hospitality. Strangers who arrive at the gates of Camelot should be fed and sheltered before anyone asks too many questions. It insists that the strong owe protection to the weak. In practice, this can lead to knights taking on burdens that no one would force on them in a colder world. A lady can stand in the hall, tears in her eyes, and ask for justice against a tyrant or a band of raiders. A knight who hears her plea may feel honor-bound to ride out, even if he is exhausted and wounded from his last task. At the same time, the court is soaked in Christian imagery and thought. Mass is said, relics are venerated, confessions are heard. The Grail, when it finally enters the Arthurian cycle fully, draws that spiritual background into the foreground. In the later, more religiously inflected versions of the story, the Holy Grail is tied to the Last Supper, or to the wounds of Christ, or to mysterious currents of grace that cannot be fully explained. When, in one of the tales, a vision of the Grail passes through the hall of Camelot, the effect is overwhelming. The room is filled with light. Food appears on the table in abundance. For a brief moment, everyone present experiences a sense of peace or sweetness that surpasses any earthly feast. Then, just as quickly, it is gone. A decision is made. The knights must ride out to seek this miraculous object in a more complete way, to see it fully, to touch it, to bring it back, if that is even possible. What began as a court of chivalry and adventure now faces a spiritual test that will, in some versions, break it. Some of the knights are honest enough to admit that they do not feel worthy. They stay, others go, and are never seen again. Some return wounded in body or mind, having glimpsed too much or failed too often. Lancelot, for all his prowess in battle, finds himself blocked at the crucial moment by his own unresolved guilt. Gawain, brave as ever, discovers that courage alone cannot open every door. Only Galahad, and sometimes a small handful of other pure-seeming figures, can truly reach the heart of the Grail mystery. For Arthur, watching his men ride out on this quest, there is an ache beneath the pride. On the one hand, it is an honor that such a holy sign has appeared at his table at all. It means his court is noticed by heaven. On the other, the Grail's arrival exposes the limits of what chivalry can achieve. It shows that even the brightest knights cannot force their way into certain kinds of grace. When the Grail quest is over, and the few who succeed are taken beyond this life, Camelot is left with fewer defenders, fewer clear symbols. It feels thinner. The shining circle is intact in shape, but some of its strongest lights have gone out. Meanwhile, outside the hall, ordinary life goes on. In later retellings, especially in art and modern imagination, the city around the court is often shown as a bustling medieval town. Market stalls, craftsmen, children playing in alleys, people drawing water from wells. You can picture a group of children with wooden sticks, mimicking jousts in the dust, shouting the names of their favorite knights, wrapping cloth around their arms to pretend they are wearing mail. To these people, Camelot is not just a backdrop for noble anguish. It is the center of law and order. If a bandit is troubling the roads, they hope that one of Arthur's men will come to deal with it. If a local lord grows too cruel, they dream that the king might hear of it and send justice. The ideals talked about at the Round Table have real consequences for them, if the knights live up to those ideals. When those standards are broken, they feel the pain in very practical ways, in lost goods, lost safety, lost trust. The storytellers do not always pause to dwell on these small lives, but they are always there, in the corners of the picture. And all the while, as feasts are held and quests are undertaken, there are small hairline cracks forming in the bright image of the court. A quiet resentment here, a harsh word there that is not taken back, a favor shown one time too many to a particular knight, making others feel less valued, a love that has crossed an invisible line, but is still pretending to be something harmless. Most of the time, these cracks can be smoothed over. A generous gift, a shared battle, a laugh at a feast, these things cover a lot. But the very intensity of the ideal makes every failure sting more. If you have built your identity on being part of the most just court in the world, then any injustice, even a small one, feels like a betrayal of the whole structure, not just of one person. The poets who shaped the later parts of the legend lean into this. They tell us that Camelot shines brightest in the years just before it falls. The hall is full, the banners are crisp, new knights are still being dubbed, stories of past victories are still told around the fire, and old warriors smile as they remember them. At some great feast, perhaps after a successful campaign, perhaps after some domestic trouble has been smoothed over, the hall is filled with music. Cups are raised, laughter runs around the circle. Arthur looks around the table and feels, for a moment, that he has achieved what he set out to build. A fellowship of the best men in the land, bound by honor rather than by fear. From the benches along the walls, servants and squires watch, warmed by the same glow. To them, it may seem that nothing could ever shake this place. But among the faces at the table, at least a few eyes are clouded. Maybe one knight is nursing a private grudge against another, over some slight real or imagined that no one else noticed. Maybe someone has seen Lancelot slip away from the hall too often when the queen is absent, and has begun to fit small observations together into a dangerous pattern. Maybe there is a man at the table who has never quite stopped wondering why he, with royal blood in his veins, sits 2 seats from the king instead of 1. The storytellers are almost gentle in the way they let this tension build. They do not smash Camelot in a single blow. Instead, they show how a series of unwise choices and secret loves and simmering resentments can wrap themselves around the core of a great institution until the weight becomes too much. The court we have been walking through in our minds, with its long, echoing hall, its shining table, its noble vows, does not disappear in an instant. It unravels, first a thread here, a thread there, until one day, in the stories, the round table will find itself called not to a feast or a quest, but to civil war. We are not quite at that point yet. For now, you can imagine this. Camelot at its fullest, its music at its loudest, its ideals spoken with confidence. If you are drowsy, you can let that picture float in your mind like a lantern on still water. A hall where the best of human courage and courtesy is gathered. Men and women who genuinely want to live up to something better than themselves. A table built round so that no one can pretend they sit above their fellows. And just beneath the surface of all that brightness, like a quiet drumbeat, you only hear when the music pauses. The knowledge that no ideal ever fits comfortably around real human hearts for long. Soon, the stories will follow that drumbeat. They will trace how love and loyalty collide, how a relative named Mordred watches and waits, how one last battle is fought on a field whose exact location no one can agree on, and how a wounded king is carried away toward a place called Avalon. But you do not have to rush there. You can stay, if you like, for a while longer in this bright moment before the fall, listening to the hum of voices in the hall of Camelot, the clink of cups, the soft rattle of armor, as knights shift in their seats, unaware of how close their golden age is to its end. Whenever you're ready to drift into the next part, the slow unspooling of betrayal, the rise of Mordred, the last battle, and the boat that slips toward the mist, just let your mind say, go on. For a long stretch in the stories, Camelot feels as if it might last forever. If you picture the hall now, you can see the round table full, every seat taken. The banners are not faded. The music is confident. There are still new tales being told of recent victories, not just nostalgic memories of old ones. From the outside, nothing looks broken, yet the same qualities that made Arthur's court shine so brightly are the ones that will eventually pull it apart. The knights are not just obedient soldiers. They are strong-minded, proud, intensely loyal to their own sense of right and wrong. The love and fellowship between them is deep, but so are their private hopes and hurts. The idea that chivalry can solve everything, that courage and courtesy will always point to the same path, is beautiful to listen to. Living it is much harder. In the heart of that bright hall sit 3 people who have been at the center of Camelot's greatness from almost the beginning. Arthur, the king who dreamed of a just court. Guinevere, the queen whose presence gives the court its grace and its living heartbeat. Lancelot, the knight whose name has become almost a spell for bravery. The tragedy of Camelot is that the same 3 lives that help make the court so extraordinary are also the lives through which it unravels. Different tellers change details, but the outline stays much the same. Lancelot and Guinevere, bound together by admiration, gratitude, and something deeper that neither of them fully meant to invite, step quietly across an invisible line. What begins as glances, as carefully chosen words at public feasts, becomes a closeness they can no longer explain away. They meet in private. They speak the kind of sentences that cannot be said within the circle of the round table. They do not want to hurt Arthur. In many versions, they love him too, in their own ways. Lancelot owes him everything. Guinevere has built most of her life around being his queen, and yet the story winds them into a knot where every choice seems wrong. Stay apart and live with a constant ache. Come together and betray the very code that gives Camelot its meaning. In a place that has built itself on open honor and clear vows, Such a secret cannot remain invisible forever. People watch. Some see only what they expect to see. A great knight and a respected queen moving gracefully through the rituals of the court. Others see a little more. Maybe they notice that Lancelot's eyes go first to the queen when he enters the hall, or that her gaze follows him when he leaves. They see how quickly he volunteers for any quest that involves rescuing her or defending her name. Among those watchers, many keep their observations to themselves, out of affection or fear, or simple reluctance to harm the king. But not everyone. In the later stories, one figure in particular grows more and more defined in this role: Mordred. Mordred's origins vary from telling to telling, and almost all of them are uncomfortable. Sometimes he is described as Arthur's nephew, the child of the king's sister and her husband. Sometimes, in darker traditions, he is the result of a night when Arthur lies with a woman he does not know is his half-sister, a sin of ignorance that will fester for years in the background of the story. Either way, Mordred carries Arthur's blood and stands close enough to the throne to feel its warmth, but not close enough to be fully content. You can imagine him growing up in the shadow of the Round Table. He sits at feasts and watches the king speak. He sees the way everyone responds to Arthur's decisions, the relief or disappointment on faces, the way reputations rise and fall with a single sentence. He notices, more keenly than most, the small flaws in the great machine. He sees which knights are favored, which are not. He is the kind of man who remembers slights that others forget. When he watches Lancelot and Guinevere, he sees not a romantic tragedy, but an opportunity. If he can prove that this golden knight and this beloved queen are breaking the great rules of the court, he can wound Arthur at the deepest level and open space for himself. In some versions, Mordred does not act alone. He has brothers or allies equally suspicious of Lancelot, equally eager to bring him down. They go to Arthur with their accusations. The king is suddenly faced with the one thing he has tried not to think about. He has heard whispers before, perhaps. He is not a fool. But we can imagine that, out of love and loyalty and a fierce desire to protect the hope embodied by his court, he has turned his face away from those whispers. Now, confronted by concrete claims from men at his own table, he can no longer look aside. If he dismisses the charges, he breaks his own laws. If he accepts them, he risks tearing apart the fellowship he built. In many tellings, he chooses a narrow, painful middle path. He allows a trap to be set. Guinevere and Lancelot are watched. They meet. The watching knights burst in. What follows is one of those sharp, violent scenes that stand out against the usually gentle rhythm of Camelot's life. Lancelot, cornered in the queen's chamber, fights like a man who knows he has already lost everything but refuses to lose his life as well. He kills several of those who came to seize him. Not nameless enemies, but familiar faces, men of the Round Table, comrades from old campaigns. By the time he escapes, the air in the corridor smells not just of smoke and torch grease, but of betrayal. Guinevere is taken. In the stories, the charge against her is not just adultery, it is treason. By breaking her marriage to the king, she is said to have broken faith with the whole realm. The sentence, as the tales often tell it, is death by burning. This, too, feels deeply symbolic. The queen who has presided over so many feasts is now to be consumed by the same element that warmed those halls. Fire. You can picture a field outside the city, or a space near the walls. A stake, bundles of wood, a crowd of people, some grim, some grieving, some stunned that things have gone this far. Arthur himself, in many versions, watches from a distance, torn between rage and a love he does not know what to do with. At the last possible moment, in almost every major retelling, Lancelot appears. He cannot allow this. Whatever wrong they have done, whatever pain their choices have caused, he cannot stand and watch Guinevere die in flames. He rides in with armed men, cuts her free, and fights his way out through yet more of his former companions. In some versions, he kills 2 knights who are especially dear to Gawain, Gareth, and Gaheris men, who had always been kind to him, and who never agreed to go along with this burning in the first place. After that day, there is no smooth path back. It is as if some line, invisible before, has been crossed, and all the unspoken tensions of the court boil over. The round table splits. Those who believe in Arthur's law, who see Guinevere and Lancelot as traitors, rally to the king. Those who love Lancelot, or who believe the sentence was too harsh, ride with him to his own lands, often imagined as lying across the sea. What began as a secret affair has become open civil war. Arthur must choose which crisis to face first. If he turns all his force against Mordred, the traitor within, Lancelot will be free to build a rival power abroad. If he turns his army against Lancelot, Mordred will stay behind, close to the throne, able to whisper and scheme. Many versions of the legend have Arthur take his main host overseas to confront Lancelot in person, leaving Mordred behind as regent. It looks like a practical, even generous, choice. Mordred is family. Giving him responsibility might bind him to Arthur's cause. Instead, it gives him exactly what he needs. Once the king and the bulk of his army are gone, Mordred begins to rearrange things. He calls councils. He points to the recent chaos and says that Arthur's time is over. Why should Britain continue to bleed for the quarrels of one man and his favorite knight? He suggests that a new ruler is needed, someone who is here, now, to keep the peace. Some lords may agree out of genuine fear that the old ways have failed. Others may simply see a chance for land, or influence, or long-desired revenge. In the bolder, more dramatic tellings, Mordred goes further still. He spreads the rumor, or makes the formal announcement that Arthur has died in the foreign war. He has himself crowned. He tries to force Guinevere, now back in Britain, to marry him so that his claim will seem more legitimate. Guinevere, caught between these dangers, escapes from him and seeks refuge in a convent. For a moment, the story stands in a strange tableau. Arthur is alive, far away, fighting someone who was once his closest friend. At home, a man with his blood is sitting on his throne, wearing his crown, attempting to take his queen. When news finally reaches Arthur news of Mordred's open treachery, he must make a choice. Some versions tell us that Lancelot, hearing what has happened, offers to help Arthur put down the usurper. It would be an extraordinary act of reconciliation. The betrayed husband and the man who betrayed him standing side by side one last time against a common enemy. Sometimes Arthur refuses the offer, unable to share a cause with Lancelot after all that has passed between them. Sometimes distance, or timing, simply makes such an alliance impossible. In any case, the king turns his ships back toward Britain. He comes home not to rebuild Camelot, but to fight his own kin in a final, desperate battle. The name that is often given to that battle is Camelot. No one is entirely sure, even now, what real place, if any, that word once pointed to. Over the centuries, different hills, river valleys, and narrow passes have been suggested. Scholars and enthusiasts look at old texts, compare them with the folds of the land, and say, here, perhaps, this ridge, this valley, this stream. No agreement stays firm for long. Camelot has become less a fixed point on a map and more a kind of idea. The last field, the place where everything that has been building finally breaks. If you imagine that field, it does not look like the bright lists where tournaments were held. The sky hangs low. The ground is uneven. The wind carries the sounds of two armies that know each other too well. One side follows Arthur, older now, heavier with memories, carrying the sword that has symbolized his kingship from the beginning. The other follows Mordred, who has shed any remaining mask of loyalty and stands openly as a rival king. Between them, ranks of men shuffle and shift, staring across at faces they may have seen in friendlier times. Some of them will have drunk together in Camelot's hall. Some will be related by blood or marriage. Some stories say that there is an attempt at a truce. Arthur and Mordred meet between the lines, each with a small escort. They speak, circling around terms that might allow both to live, if not in peace, then at least without immediate slaughter. They agree, in some tellings, on a simple condition. No one on either side is to draw a sword while they speak. If that rule holds, the truce will hold. Then something small happens. At the back of one army, a soldier sees a snake crawling out of the grass near his feet. Startled, afraid of being bitten, he pulls his sword to strike at it. The flash of steel in the sunlight is seen by men on the other side who do not know about the snake. They only see a sword lifted that was supposed to stay sheathed. Someone shouts in alarm. On both sides, nerves stretched tight by days of marching and nights of grim campfire talk finally snap. Blades are drawn. Within moments, the cautious meeting between Arthur and Mordred collapses into full battle. The snake itself, if there ever was one, is forgotten. What remains is a picture of how fragile peace can be when trust is thin and tempers are primed. How easily a single misunderstanding, a flinch, a reflex can turn into a storm of violence. The poets speak of that battle as a slaughter. Steel clashes, men fall. The ground churns to mud beneath trampling feet. By the time the sun is lowering, almost all of the knights of the Round Table who remain are dead or dying. Mordred is cut down, often imagined as facing Arthur directly in one last, savage exchange. The future that might have been clashing with the past that is ending. Arthur himself does not fall at once, but he is wounded, and the wound is mortal. When the noise of the battlefield ebbs a little, he is carried away from the press of bodies and the clamor of finishing blows. Some traditions place him in a small chapel nearby, others simply on a quiet patch of ground. In either case, the once greatest of kings lies on something simple, a bed or a cloak spread over the earth. The man who once presided over feasts in a hall called Camelot now stares up at the open sky, wondering what, if anything, will remain of all he tried to build. Around him stand only a few survivors. Among them, often, is a knight called Bedivere, or Bedwyr, in older forms, one of his most faithful companions. Arthur looks at the sword beside him. Excalibur has been more than a weapon. Its presence by his side in story after story has seemed to guarantee that Camelot still stands, that the king still lives, that justice is still, at least in theory, possible. Arthur knows that such a symbol cannot be allowed to fall into random hands. He tells Bedivere to take the sword, walk to a nearby body of water, and throw it in. Perhaps he says that what was given by mysterious forces should return to them. Perhaps he simply knows that if someone were to find this blade later, they might use it to claim a kingship that does not belong to them. Bedivere takes the sword. He walks away from the sound of Arthur's ragged breathing, past broken shields and still forms, down toward the place where water waits. When he reaches the water's edge, he looks at what he carries. The hilt of the sword gleams with jewels. The metal is worked in patterns that catch the light. It is a physical reminder of everything Arthur's court once meant. Hope, strength, a different way of ruling. To cast it into dark water feels wrong. On his first trip, Bedivere cannot bring himself to do it. Instead, he hides the blade among reeds or in a clump of bushes and walks back, empty-handed. Arthur, watching him, asks what he saw. Nothing, Bedivere says. The sword fell, and the water took it. That was all. Arthur knows this is not the truth. He has lived too long with this man at his side not to recognize the way his eyes avoid his. There is a second attempt. Once more, Bedivere takes the sword and walks to the water. Once more, he hesitates. Perhaps he thinks that if Arthur lives, he will be grateful to have the sword still close at hand. Perhaps he simply cannot stomach the thought of such beauty vanishing without a trace. Again, he hides it. Again, he returns. And again, Arthur questions him. This time, there is anger behind the king's voice, and sorrow. He speaks sharply, telling Bedivere that he has served faithfully until now, but that disobedience in this last thing wounds him more deeply than the spear already in his flesh. On the third trip, Bedivere forces himself to obey. He grips the hilt, walks to the water's edge, and with a single motion flings the sword out over the dark surface. Now, the stories slow down. The blade arcs through the air. It does not simply splash and sink. A hand, clad in a sleeve of shimmering fabric, some say silk, some say something stranger, rises from beneath the surface, catches the falling sword by its hilt, and lifts it high. The hand brandishes it 3 times in the air, as if in salute or farewell. Then both sword and arm sink back beneath the water, leaving ripples and widening circles of light. Bedivere stands staring, heart loud in his ears, until the rings on the water flatten. Then he returns to Arthur and tells him exactly what he has seen. The king, hearing this, knows that the weapon has gone back to wherever it came from. One chapter of his story, truly, is closed. Soon after, a new presence arrives. Out on the surface of the water, a boat appears, or perhaps has been there all along, half hidden by mist. In it stand or sit women veiled or hooded, sometimes called queens, sometimes associated with figures like Morgan Le Fay, Arthur's half-sister, who in some tales has moved from rival to something more ambiguous and powerful. They do not come as enemies now. They come as mourners and as guides. They receive Arthur into the boat with ceremony, and the small craft glides away into the mist, heading toward a place the stories call Avalon. Avalon, the island of apples, the hidden land of healing, a place that is not quite life and not quite death. The legends are rarely precise. Some describe it as a kind of enchanted hospital where Arthur's wounds can be tended until the time comes for him to return. Others simply leave it as a word, a signpost to somewhere else, a realm just beyond the edge of what we can see. In either case, the image is haunting. A wounded king, carried away in silence across still water, while his last loyal friend stands on the shore, watching until boat and figure and mist melt together and vanish from sight. On one level, it is the end. Camelot has fallen. The round table is broken. The king is gone. On another level, the story refuses to close so neatly. If Arthur does not quite die, but instead goes to rest in Avalon, then the door is left ajar for a familiar hope that he will return when his land needs him again. He becomes the once and future king, sleeping somewhere just out of reach, ready to come back in a longed-for hour. That hope will run quietly under the surface of British stories for centuries. Meanwhile, in the world of stone and earth, people begin to look around and ask a new set of questions. Not just what happened to Camelot in the stories, but where did all this take place? Where could Avalon be? Where might Arthur have ruled? Where might his bones lie? In the centuries after the fall of Camelot in the tales, real monasteries, churches, and towns discover that there is power in being able to point to a hill or a tomb and say, here is where the great king rests. One place, above all others, steps forward to claim the role of Avalon. If you picture a watery, marshy landscape in the west of England, low meadows, reedy pools, mists that hug the ground, you can imagine how certain hills would stand out like islands. On one of these rises a steep, conical mound that people will later call Glastonbury Tor. At its base, over time, a great abbey grows rich. To early visitors, the area can look like another world when the waters are high, a place half land, half lake, an island of old stories. Long before anyone links it to Arthur, the region has a reputation in Celtic tradition as a place that does not sit entirely in ordinary space and time. Then, late in the 12th century, disaster strikes the abbey. A terrible fire rips through the buildings, destroying much and leaving the monks with an enormous problem. They need to rebuild. Rebuilding takes money. Money comes from patrons and pilgrims. Pilgrims are drawn to places that promise deep holiness or extraordinary relics. Around the same moment in history, rulers in England are aware that, in some parts of Wales and beyond, people still cherish Arthur, not as a dead king, but as a sleeping one who will return. From their point of view, that kind of hope is dangerous. It suggests that the current order is temporary, that a different, perhaps more rightful ruler might still rise. A king who is definitely dead is less troublesome than a king who might come back. So when the monks of Glastonbury announce that they have made a remarkable discovery in their cemetery, they are telling people exactly what many powerful ears want to hear. According to the accounts written later, the monks say that, while digging between two ancient stone markers, they found a large grave. Inside it, in a hollowed-out tree trunk used as a coffin, lay the bones of a very tall man and those of a smaller woman. Alongside them was a leaden cross. On that cross, they report, were words identifying the grave as that of Arthur and his queen, and the place as the Isle of Avalon. Details vary between tellings. Some emphasize the great size of the man's bones. Some dwell on the exact wording of the inscription, but the core point is the same. Avalon, they say, is here. Arthur is here. He is not asleep under some distant hill, waiting to return. He is in our churchyard. His story is finished. From a modern perspective, the timing and usefulness of this discovery make many scholars suspicious. The abbey needed funds and attention. The monarchy needed Arthur safely in the ground. Producing a royal grave with a helpful label satisfies both needs at once. We have no way now to test those bones, or to see the cross as it first appeared. The remains were moved, exposed, and lost in later upheavals. The tomb the monks created as a shrine is long empty, yet, in their own time, the claim makes waves. Pilgrims come, kings and nobles visit, bowing their heads near the new tomb, perhaps speaking quietly to the famous dead. Glastonbury, already holy, becomes woven tightly into the Arthurian web. Even if you believe, as many do today, that the monks shaped the find to fit a story, their act tells us something important. It shows how strongly the legend had taken hold. People were willing to reshape the landscape, the narrative of a place, perhaps even the ground itself, to bring the stories into alignment with something they could touch. By now, as you lie here listening, the legend of Arthur and Camelot has already lived many lives. A rough war leader, half seen in early texts. A conquering king in Geoffrey's Latin chronicle. A noble figure at the heart of French romances. The focus of courtly love and spiritual quests. The tragic ruler, whose court collapses under the weight of its own ideals. A king carried to Avalon. A name scratched on a discovered cross at Glastonbury. And the story does not stop there. It will move again, through prisons and print shops, through royal propaganda and romantic poetry, through archaeological trenches and quiet museum cases. Each age that inherits Arthur and Camelot makes them a little different, asks them a slightly new set of questions. We could stop here, with the boat vanishing into the mist and the supposed tomb newly opened in a ruined abbey. But if you still have room in your drifting thoughts, we can follow the legend further into the cells where Thomas Malory writes, into the halls where Tudor kings repaint Arthur's round table in their own colours, into the studios of Victorian painters, and onto the hills where 20th century archaeologists kneel in the mud, trowels in hand, searching for traces of a real Camelot under the grass. All the while, your body can grow heavier and softer against the mattress, your breathing slow and easy, as if the centuries themselves are lulling you towards sleep. Centuries slide by. After that boat slips into the mist, kings rise and fall who never think of Arthur at all. Others think of him constantly. The stories keep moving, not only in the mouths of storytellers, but now in something new and powerful. Books. Somewhere in 15th century England, a man sits in a cell. The light that reaches him is narrow, falling in a pale stripe across straw and stone. We know his name as Thomas Malory. The records that mention him accuse him of various crimes, raids, theft, perhaps even violence. He may or may not have been guilty of everything written down against him. The past is blurry on this point. What we do know is that, while imprisoned, he has time to think about the old stories he has heard, time to read. On a rough table, he has access to French romances, English poems, bits of Latin chronicles. He begins to do something ambitious. He decides to gather all these scattered tales of Arthur and his knights into one large, flowing narrative. As he works, you can imagine his hands moving slowly over the page, ink blotting on thick paper. He copies, translates, shortens some episodes, expands others. He does not invent the legend, but he does give it a new shape. He writes not in Latin, the language of scholars, and not in French, the language of the old aristocracy, but in English. That choice matters. English is the tongue of the country's future. By casting Arthur's saga in that language, Mallory anchors it in the version of speech that will eventually carry Shakespeare, the King James Bible, modern novels, and, far in the future, the subtitles under someone's sleep video. Mallory's work will later be known by a title printers give it: Le Mort d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur. But it is not just about the end. It walks from Arthur's enchanted conception all the way through the rise of Camelot, the loves and feuds of the Round Table, the Grail quest, and finally that last journey toward Avalon. In Mallory's hands, the different threads we've been drifting through: Geoffrey's king, the French knights, and their love stories. The English traditions are woven into one thick rope. When you read his version, it can feel like stepping into the definitive version of the legend, even though it is really only one more layer. Mallory does not spend many words pinning Camelot to a particular spot on the map. He mentions real towns here and there. He nods toward older associations like Caerleon. He knows about Winchester, where a massively heavy round table made of timber hangs even in his day on the wall of a great hall. That table is not truly from Arthur's time. Later analysis shows it was built centuries after the age when any historical war leader might have lived. But it is old enough and impressive enough to make people's breath catch when they stand under it. Mallory weaves it into his imagined world. In his time, the Round Table is no longer only a story image. It is something you can walk up to and touch, running your fingers along painted names. Around the same period, another man is making his own kind of magic. William Caxton is setting up a printing press. For the first time in England, words can be carved into metal and used to stamp page after page with identical text. No longer does every copy of a book depend on months of patient copying by hand. In the late 15th century, Caxton prints Mallory's Arthur, the legend, which has drifted for centuries through spoken tales and handwritten manuscripts, now has a solid, repeatable form. You can imagine someone in a small house, decades later, opening a printed volume and seeing the story of Arthur and Camelot laid out in dense black lines, each page matching the next. The tales are still elastic in many ways, but they are also pinned, for the first time, to a specific sequence of words. As the medieval world tips into what we call the early modern period, kings and queens begin to see another use for Arthur. He is no longer just a hero of old, but a tool. When the Tudor dynasty comes to power after brutal civil wars, the new rulers are eager to show that they have deep roots in the land, that they are not just upstarts. Genealogists and storytellers are encouraged, sometimes quite firmly, to trace lines that connect the Tudors to ancient British kings. Arthur is too glittering a figure to ignore. Henry VII names his first son Arthur and arranges for him to be born not just anywhere, but at Winchester, the place where that great wooden round table already hangs. Around the same time, the table itself is repainted. New colors, new details. A Tudor rose at its center. If you stood in that hall after the repainting, you would see more than a symbol of an old legend. You would see a statement. The message is quiet but clear. This new royal family belongs in the same story as the greatest legendary king of the Britons. The Round Table, that image of ideal fellowship, now carries their marks. The real Prince Arthur dies young. His younger brother becomes Henry VIII instead, but the gesture lingers. Arthur has been claimed not only by poets and monks, but by the machinery of royal power. While this is happening in palaces and abbeys, other, less official voices keep the more rugged side of the legend alive. In Wales and Cornwall, Scholars and bards continue to copy and recite older Welsh material, where Arthur hunts great boars, visits otherworldly strongholds, and fights not just Saxons but giants and magical beasts. On the European continent, translators and adapters reshape the Grail stories, Arthurian episodes merging with local narrative styles, German, Scandinavian, and more. Through all these changes, Camelot remains strangely blurry and stubbornly solid at the same time. No one can say exactly where it stood, yet everyone seems to be able to picture it. By the 18th century, Europe is in the grip of what we usually call the Enlightenment. Reason, measurement, and clear lines of cause and effect are prized. Medieval tales of kings and miracles can look, to some thinkers of that age, like childish things to be set aside. Then tastes swing again. In the 19th century, after years of classical statues and straight-edged thinking, a different mood rises. This new tide, often called Romanticism, brings with it a hunger for old ruins, wild landscapes, intense emotions, and half-forgotten legends. If you think of a grey abbey with ivy on its broken walls, a lone knight standing by a cliff in a storm, a woman in a long dress staring into a dark river you are seeing through romantic eyes, Arthur and Camelot fit this appetite perfectly. In Britain, one of the loudest voices in this movement is a poet called Alfred Tennyson. He spends years working on a series of poems that retell the Arthurian cycle in a language modern for his time, but soaked in medieval colour. When his Idylls of the King are published and read by gaslight in Victorian parlours, they give a new generation their mental picture of Camelot. Tennyson's Arthur is not the rough war leader of a collapsing Roman world. He is more like a moral beacon trying to hold a pure court together in a time of corruption. Camelot, in Tennyson's mind, has towers and a shining river. It is detailed, watercolour-rich, and always a little unreal. In one of his most famous poems, The Lady of Shalott, he never quite takes us all the way into Camelot. Instead, he places us upstream, in a lonely tower where a woman is cursed to see the world only as a reflection in a mirror. She weaves what she sees. Knights riding, reapers in a field, people moving in the distance. When she finally turns to look directly at Lancelot as he rides toward Camelot, the curse falls on her. She leaves the tower, finds a boat, writes her name on its side, lies down in it, and drifts down the river toward the city, dead or dying. By the time she reaches Camelot's quays, she is a mystery to those who see her, a silent figure floating in from the mist. That image becomes one of the most enduring visual pictures of Camelot in later art. Towers by the water, dark river, the glow of torches on the quay, and a boat carrying someone whose story is both part of the legend and slightly off to its side. The group of painters, called the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, takes up Tennyson's vision and makes it vivid. They paint Guinevere as proud and troubled, Lancelot as beautiful and haunted, the Lady of Shalott as pale and still. Behind them, glimpsed through windows or across water, are fragments of Camelot, arches, staircases, glimpses of walls, reflections. None of these artists have seen a real Camelot, of course, but by painting it again and again, they fix certain shapes and colours in the mind of anyone who looks at their work. For many people even today, if you say Camelot, the unconscious picture that comes is half Tennyson, half Pre-Raphaelite, towers and river, tapestries and long hair, golden light and deep, deep shadow. While poets and painters are busy with this romantic Camelot, people with a different kind of curiosity are out walking the actual hills and fields of Britain. They call themselves antiquarians. Later, their work will grow into what we now call archaeology. They tramp along old Roman roads, sketch ancient earthworks, and write down what local people say about odd features in the landscape. They are not always precise by modern standards, but they are often very observant. In Wales, they stand in the broken oval of the Roman amphitheatre at Caerleon, the place Geoffrey chose centuries earlier as Arthur's court, and imagine it full of armoured men. In Cornwall, They climb the steep path to Tintagel, a dramatic headland surrounded by sea where Geoffrey claimed Arthur was conceived. There, they look at the ruins of a later castle built on the site, and note that the rocks, the wind, and the waves all feel suitably legendary, even if the stones under their feet are far younger than any real Arthur could have been. In Somerset, on a low hill surrounded by wide, flat fields, another place begins to stir their interest. It is called Cadbury Castle. From a distance, it looks like a gently sloping green mound with sheep grazing on it. When you get closer, you see that the slope is not simple. There are deep, man-made ditches and banks circling the hill, the remains of powerful defences. In the 16th century, a royal surveyor named John Leland visits this hill. He asks local people what they call it. They tell him that it is known as Camelot, or something close to that, and that stories say it was once a famous stronghold of Arthur. Leland writes this down in his notes. He cannot know that this small line will lie quietly in his papers for centuries before it blooms. Time moves on. Interest in Arthur waxes and wanes. Sometimes he sits at the center of fashionable taste. Sometimes he recedes into children's books and the corners of folklore, but he never vanishes. By the 20th century, archaeology has become much more systematic. When people dig now, they record every layer, every fragment of pottery, every change in soil color. They use these clues to date and reconstruct what once stood where they now kneel in the dirt. The old hint that Cadbury Castle might be Camelot attracts new attention. In the 1960 seconds, an archaeologist named Leslie Alcock leads a serious excavation there. If you imagine the hill in that decade, you see not armored knights, but figures in muddy boots and wool sweaters, crouched over trenches. There are trowels scraping carefully, measuring tapes stretched out, little flags marking significant finds. The dig reveals that Cadbury has been used many times. There are traces of occupation in the Iron Age, long before any Romans came. There are Roman materials too. Most tantalizingly, there is evidence that, in the late 5th and 6th centuries, exactly the time when any real Arthur would have lived, the defences were rebuilt on a grand scale. The ramparts were strengthened with stone. Inside, there was a large hall, big enough to host gatherings of high-status people. Pottery from distant regions appears, showing that whoever lived here had trade links that reached far beyond the local valleys. Stand on the top of that hill even now, and you can see why someone would choose it. The view spreads out in all directions. On a clear day, you can even glimpse the dark shape of Glastonbury Tor on the horizon. Newspapers at the time cannot resist headlines. Camelot found, Arthur's castle unearthed. Photographers take pictures of wheelbarrows and trenches. A committee is formed to support the investigations. For the archaeologists themselves, the more cautious phrasing is something like this. Here is a major stronghold from the right period, in a region linked to many Arthurian traditions. It looks like exactly the sort of place a powerful war leader might have based himself. It does not prove that Arthur was here, but it shows what a real Camelot might look like on the ground. Not marble towers, but a big timber hall on a wind-swept hill, ringed by earth and stone. Elsewhere, other sites step forward. At Camelot, people continue to point at the Roman amphitheatre and say, "This was Arthur's court," or "This might have been one of his main seats," tying Geoffrey's account to the stones. At Tintagel, modern excavations peel back the layers beneath the later castle. They find traces of earlier buildings from the late Roman and early medieval period, and shards of imported pottery from faraway shores. Someone, long ago, lived and ruled here with enough wealth to bring goods from the Mediterranean to this wave-beaten rock in Cornwall. A scrap of stone is found with scratched letters on it, a name that some briefly connect to old British nobles. For a while, excitement bubbles again. Then scholars look more carefully. The name is too common to prove anything, so the hype settles, leaving something still precious behind. Tintagel is not only a romantic cliff, but a documented high-status site in the right era. At Glastonbury, archaeologists trace the growth of the abbey itself. They map out how buildings rose and fell, how the cemetery shifted, how the Great Fire damaged the place. They look for traces of the supposed grave. Too many later disturbances make certainty impossible. The cross and bones the monks once showed are long gone. Most specialists today suspect that the discovery of Arthur's grave there was shaped heavily by economic and political needs. Even if you strip away the claim about Arthur, the site remains powerful. The ruins of the church stand under the changing sky. Visitors walk across grass where monks once processed, aware that in this place, more than one story has been layered into the soil. On Bodmin Moor, in Cornwall, there is another curious monument, a rectangle of massive standing stones, stark against the open landscape. Locals for years called it King Arthur's Hall. Its lonely shape, its quiet air, and its name made many people weave it into the legend. Then, more careful studies of the surrounding peat and sediment suggest that it is thousands of years older than any imagined King Arthur. Neolithic, not medieval. Once again, the legend has draped an older structure in newer clothes. The stones do not become less mysterious because of the new dating. They simply move to a different chapter of human story. Over and over, the modern search for Camelot plays out in this way. Someone notices a hill, an old wall, a mound. Stories attach themselves to it, often over centuries. Eventually, archaeologists arrive with their trowels and notebooks. Sometimes they find that the popular tales match the period surprisingly well. Sometimes they find that the Arthurian layer is an afterthought, a newer gloss painted over a much older relic. In recent decades, new tools have joined the trowel. Ground-penetrating radar sends ripples of energy into the soil and listens for echoes, building ghostly pictures of buried structures without disturbing them. Magnetometers detect subtle changes in the Earth's magnetic field caused by old ditches, pits, or fired clay under the surface. Aerial and satellite photography show faint lines in crops patterns where buried walls or roads affect how plants grow. Scholars use these methods on hills, valleys, and plains all over Britain, some with Arthurian connections, some without. Sometimes the results are dramatic. A long-lost building appears as a pale rectangle under green fields, like a shadow pinned to the land. Other times, the signs are so faint that they only raise more questions. A line here: Roman fort, early church, medieval farm, or the outline of a great hall where someone like Arthur once held council. Beyond the structures themselves, scientists also look outward and upward. Ice cores from far-off Greenland, tree rings from ancient oaks, and layers of mud in European lakes all hold traces of climate. When they are studied carefully, a pattern emerges. Around the middle of the 6th century, roughly the time when that decisive battle at Badon is often placed in scholarly reconstructions, something strange happened in the sky. Evidence points to one or more volcanic eruptions so large that they threw dust and aerosols high into the atmosphere, dimming sunlight for several years in a row. Some chronicles from Europe talk about summers without warmth, harvests that fail, a sun that looks pale even at noon. Imagine a Britain already reeling from political fragmentation and waves of newcomers, now facing years when the weather itself seems to turn against them. In such a time, the memory of a strong leader who managed to hold the line even briefly would take on an extra glow. He would not just be a war hero. He would be a symbol of stability in a world where the seasons themselves felt unreliable. Modern genetics adds its own layer of quiet information. Scientists study old bones from cemeteries across England and Wales, examining patterns in DNA. They find that the spread of Anglo-Saxon culture was not simply a clean replacement of one population by another, but a more complicated mixture. Some regions show more ancestry from people who came across the North Sea. Others keep more of the genetic signatures of older British groups. From this, we get a picture of a patchwork land. Some valleys where newcomers became dominant quickly, others where local elites held on longer. perhaps making deals, perhaps fighting. Again, this does not prove Arthur, but it sets the stage more clearly. It shows us the kind of world in which a coalition of British groups might have needed a commander, and in which victory at a place like Bedtime would have felt like a breath of relief. All the while, in the background, the stories keep being retold in film, television, and novels. One version puts Arthur in heavy Roman armor, a practical war leader in a muddy, grim Britain, almost entirely stripped of magic. Another still drenches Camelot in enchantment, wizards, prophecies, fairy ladies in lakes. One series shifts the focus to Guinevere or to Morgan, asking what this world looks like from their eyes. Another brings the legend into different times and places entirely, making Camelot stand for any dream of a better court, a fairer politics. These modern interpretations feed back into how ordinary people imagine the legend. If a movie shows Camelot as a city of white stone spires, visitors to South Cadbury may feel a small jolt of disappointment when they reach its grassy summit and see only earth banks and sheep. If a popular novel insists that Arthur ruled from a specific hill or town, fans may cling fiercely to that vision, even when new research suggests other possibilities. At the same time, writers and filmmakers read archaeological reports. A careful author might decide to place Arthur's Hall in a setting modelled on Cadbury or Wroxeter or some other documented site. A director might study how timber halls were built in the 5th century and echo that in a set. So the line between research and imagination runs both ways. Scholars influence storytellers. Storytellers influence what places tourists want to see. Tourist interest can, in turn, influence which sites get funding for further research. If you ask most cautious historians today whether Arthur really existed, many of them will answer with something like this. There very likely were military leaders in post-Roman Britain who fought successful battles against newcomers. Some of these leaders may have had names that echo the early forms of Arthur. Over time, their deeds, along with older Celtic tales and later courtly ideals, were stitched together into one figure much larger than any single man. If you ask those same historians where Camelot stood, they will often smile a little and say, the name itself probably comes from the French romances, not from the earliest layers of the story. No one site has yet produced evidence that can be tied to an Arthurian court beyond doubt. Cadbury is a very strong candidate for a major British stronghold of the right period. Caerleon, Tintagel, Wroxeter, and other places all have their own claims and their own evidence. In other words, geographically, the case remains open. And yet, if you look at a modern map of Britain and trace your finger across certain points, you will find that Arthur and Camelot have already drawn their own lines. Cadbury, in Somerset, Caerleon on the Usk, Tintagel's cliffs, Glastonbury Tor, Wroxeter's quiet fields, Bodmin Moor's stone rectangle, Winchester's painted round table. Each of these locations is linked not only by roads and train lines, but by stories. Pilgrims of a new sort, tourists, readers, viewers, curious wanderers, follow those stories like beads on a string. They stand on Cadbury's summit and think of Arthur's Hall. They lean on the rail at Tintagel and listen to the sea, hearing Geoffrey's stormy conception scene and Tennyson's later, softer echoes. They walk through Glastonbury's ruins and remember the monks who dug up Arthur's grave, whether or not the bones were ever his. They tilt their heads back under the round table at Winchester, reading the painted names, feeling the weight of the wood above them. Each experience adds another layer. The land shapes the legend. The legend shapes how people see the land. If, one day, some dramatic new discovery were made, an inscription on a stone that clearly named a ruler Arthur and a hall Camelot, the story would not settle once and for all. It would simply grow another branch. People would add that stone to the chain of Glastonbury's grave, Cadbury's hall, Tintagel's shards, Mallory's prison, Tennyson's desk, a modern archaeologist's trench. Meanwhile, the quieter truths would still be there, waiting in the background, that at some point, in the dim centuries after Rome let go of Britain, men stood on a hillside and fought not to be pushed back any further, that their struggle struck deep enough in the minds of those who lived through it, that a memory endured, handed on, embroidered, and expanded, that monks added moral lessons to that memory. Courtly poets added love and etiquette. Later writers added spiritual quests and tragic falls. Printers gave the tale fixed pages. Kings borrowed its glow. Artists painted its scenes. Archaeologists mapped its possible settings. And people, lying in beds, in small rooms, centuries later, listening to a quiet voice talk about Arthur and Camelot, still feel something stir at the thought that there might once have been a leader who held the line when everything else was falling apart. You do not have to decide, as you drift at the edge of sleep, exactly how much of Arthur is history and how much is dream. You can let the whole layered structure stand in your mind like a hill at dusk. Under the grass, there are old walls, older ditches, stones from many eras. On top, sheep graze. Above, the sky darkens slowly. Somewhere beyond that hill, a boat slides across a lake toward an island you cannot quite see. In a ruined abbey, monks light candles in front of a new-made tomb. In a painted hall, a round table hangs on a wall with names inscribed around its rim. In a city, a poet bends over his desk and writes, "The king will return." In your room, the air is still. Your breathing is slow. If you like, you can imagine Arthur's story continuing on without you now, winding through more centuries, into more hands, changing shape again and again, while you slip gently out of the waking world and into your own quiet Avalon, where there are no more questions to answer and no more battles to fight tonight. By the time the monks at Glastonbury are proudly showing visitors the tomb of Arthur and his queen, the stories about Camelot have already lived for centuries in people's mouths and on parchment. But another change is coming. In England, sometime in the 15th century, a man sits in a cell outside his prison walls. The country is full of its own troubles, shifting loyalties, battles between rival houses, the long, messy struggle we call the Wars of the Roses. Inside, with not much to do except think, this man reaches backward with his mind into a world of old tales. We know him as Thomas Malory. We do not know exactly what kind of man he was in his everyday life. Legal records accuse him of violence, theft, and other dark deeds. He may well have been the sort of knight that Camelot's code of chivalry would have frowned upon. And yet, from his confinement, he undertakes a strange and beautiful task. He starts to gather the wandering Arthurian stories into one long river. He reaches for French romances, English poems, Latin chronicles. He smooths some parts, connects others, chooses which episodes to emphasize. He lets us see Arthur's magical conception, Arthur pulling a sword from a stone, Arthur establishing his court, Arthur's knights riding out on countless adventures, the forbidden love of Lancelot and Guinevere, the Grail quest, the fall at Camelot, the journey to Avalon. All of it flows together in a language that finally is plain English, not Latin for clerics, not French for conquerors, but the everyday tongue of the land, still rough-edged in places, but heading toward what we would recognize as our own. If you imagine Malory at his writing, you might see a man listening in his mind to the clatter and murmur of a court that no longer exists, fixing it in ink before it fades completely. He is not inventing Arthur from nothing. He is more like someone weaving a huge tapestry out of many older threads. Still, his choices have consequences. He gives more weight to some tales, less to others. He arranges events in a particular order. He sets the rhythm. From then on, for many readers in England, Arthur means Malory's Arthur. When William Caxton sets up his printing press and decides to print Malory's work toward the end of the 15th century, that work, which we often call Le Morte d'Arthur, becomes easier to copy, easier to own. Instead of a single precious manuscript in a rich man's library, there are now multiple copies moving through the world. It is as if Camelot, which once existed only in telling and retelling, has been nailed to the page with small blocks of inked metal. Even in Mallory's version, Camelot as a physical city is still strangely blurred. He mentions towns that claim a connection, Caerleon on Usk, for instance, and he also brings in another curious object from the real world. In the Great Hall at Winchester, there hangs, and still hangs today, a massive wooden round table several meters across. It was built in the Middle Ages, long after any historical Arthur, but it is old in Mallory's time, impressive and heavy. A king could stand in that hall with his guests and look up at the circular slab of timber on the wall and feel the tug of the legend. Mallory folds Winchester into his network of Arthurian places. He is not precise. He does not give us GPS coordinates. But now, for anyone visiting that hall, it is tempting to point at the huge round table and say, "There, that's it. That's the round table." No matter that the wood dates from centuries too late, the legend has found another anchor. As the centuries turn and a new dynasty takes the throne, Arthur's name gains another layer of meaning. The Tudor kings, who emerge victorious from bitter civil wars, are keen to show that they are not just lucky soldiers with crowns. They want deep roots. They want to appear as the rightful heirs of ancient British greatness. Arthur, with his blend of British pride and Christian kingship, is a perfect figure for them to claim. Henry VII names his eldest son, Arthur. He arranges for the boy to be born at Winchester, the place with the great round table hanging on the wall. The table itself is repainted, with bright colours and new designs. Heraldic symbols, including the Tudor rose, are added, as if to say, this is not just an old story. It belongs to us now. The real Prince Arthur dies young. It is his brother, Henry VIII, who will rule in his place. But the message lingers in stone, and wood, and paint. Arthur is no longer only a figure in romances. He is being used as a kind of royal ancestor, a stamp of legitimacy on a fragile new line. All this time, when people enjoy Arthurian tales, they are usually not imagining muddy hill forts and smoke-stained timber halls. They see something closer to their own courts, great stone chambers, rich tapestries, elaborate ceremonies. The history and the now blur. Then, slowly, fashion shifts. For a while, in the age we sometimes call Enlightenment, people become more cautious about stories of magic and knights. They prefer reason, measurement, and practical prose. Arthur never quite disappears, but he dips below the surface of high culture. He is still there in cheap chapbooks, in local folklore, in quiet corners of libraries. He is waiting. In the 19th century, the tide turns again. Romantic poets and painters fall in love with the Middle Ages, or at least with a dream of them. They are drawn to ruined abbeys, moonlit lakes, armor glinting in forest clearings, tragic love, and lofty ideals. In Britain, one of the strongest voices in this movement is Alfred, Lord Tennyson. Tennyson takes Mallory's tales and retells them in long, musical poems. His Arthur is less a rough war captain and more a moral figure, a man struggling to keep his court pure in a world he sees as decaying around him. His Camelot is painted in richer detail than ever before. You can almost see the towers and bridges, the reflection of shields in the river, the way sunlight strikes the stone at different times of day. One of Tennyson's most famous pieces, The Lady of Shalott, does not even focus directly on Arthur. Instead, it gives us a solitary woman under a strange curse, living in a tower near Camelot. She is forbidden to look at the world directly. She can only see it reflected in a mirror and weave what she sees into a tapestry. One day, she catches sight of Lancelot riding past, shining and beautiful, and turns to look at him with her own eyes. The mirror cracks. The curse falls. She leaves her tower, steps into a boat, writes her name on the prow, and drifts down the river toward Camelot, dead or dying by the time she arrives, while people on the quay look at her in wonder and confusion. Painters seize on that image, the lady in the boat, the dark water, the distant towers of Camelot lit in the background. The pre-Raphaelite artists, a loose group fascinated by medieval subjects, symbolic detail, and intense color, paint scene after scene from Arthurian legend. Their Guinevere looks proud and guilty. Their Lancelot is often haunted. Their knights walk in cloisters, lean on stone parapets, or kneel in armor beside pale, enigmatic women. In their canvases, Camelot appears not as a precise map location, but as an atmosphere. Stone arches, reflections in water, banners beside riverfront steps. For countless viewers, these images fix what Arthur's world should look like. Even today, if someone asks you to picture Camelot, your mind might unconsciously borrow from those paintings. The combination of river, tower, barge, and soft, golden light. While the poets and artists are busy making the legend glow in this new way, a different kind of curiosity is stirring quietly in the fields and hills. Antiquarians, the early cousins of archaeologists, roam the countryside, taking notes on old mounds, stone circles, ruined walls. They read medieval texts and try to match their place names to real landscapes. One of these is John Leland, a 16th century scholar sent by the king to survey the realm's ancient monuments. In his travels, Leland visits a hill in Somerset, a strong, steep rise with deep rings cut into its sides, old earthworks from distant centuries. The locals, he writes, call it Camelot, and say it was once a mighty fortress of Arthur. We now usually call this place Cadbury Castle, or South Cadbury. If you climb it in your mind, you find yourself walking up through trees, breaking out into open air on the summit. Wind tugs at your clothes. From the top, you look out over the Somerset countryside. On a clear day, your eyes can pick out another distinctive shape on the horizon. Glastonbury Tor. Leland does not dig. He has no modern tools. He simply notes what he sees, and hears the impressive earthworks, the local talk of Camelot. Then he moves on. His brief comment lies quietly in his manuscripts for centuries, like a seed waiting for rain. As time goes on, more hills and ruins gather Arthur's name. If there is a dramatic headland in Cornwall with castle ruins on it, Tintagel, and a writer like Geoffrey of Monmouth once said, Arthur was conceived there, it is natural for people to climb its narrow paths, stand on its high rocks, and think, this must be an Arthur place. If there is a great ruined abbey that claims to be Avalon, Glastonbury pilgrims will come, mixing spiritual longing with a desire to be near the king who may or may not have lain beneath those stones. If there is a Roman city in the Midlands Viroconium, near modern Wroxeter with signs of a late, large timber hall built inside abandoned stone blocks, then some will look at that and whisper, Camelot, under their breath. By the 20th century, archaeology has become more disciplined. Excavations are not just holes in the ground. They are carefully planned, measured, and recorded. Layers of soil are peeled back like pages, each one labeled with its own context. In the 1,960 seconds, a group led by Leslie Alcock decides to take John Leland's old notes seriously. They organize digs at South Cadbury. Trowels scrape, spades lift earth, trenches reveal the shapes lurking under the grass. They find that the hill was indeed an important place for a long time. There are traces of very early occupation, long before Arthur's supposed era. There are signs of Roman period use. Most exciting for those thinking about Arthur, there is strong evidence that, in the centuries after Rome's power receded, roughly the time when the leader of battles might have lived, someone undertook major building work on the hill. The ramparts were refaced and strengthened. Inside the fortifications, the archaeologists trace the footprint of a large timber hall, big enough to hold a noble household, councils, feasts, the sort of building where a local king or powerful warlord might sit in splendor. They find pieces of pottery that did not come from the immediate neighborhood. Some are imported from as far away as the Mediterranean. That means that whoever lived up here on this windy height was plugged into long-distance trade. Not a petty nobody, but someone with connections. If you stand on that summit now, in your imagination, and overlay the chalk outlines of the hall on the grass, it is not hard to picture a long roof of thatch or shingles, smoke drifting from a central opening, figures moving in and out of a doorway carrying dishes, the sound of a harp rising faintly above conversations. Newspapers at the time of the excavation cannot resist the temptation. They print headlines suggesting that Camelot has been found. For the archaeologists actually working in the mud, things are more complicated. The honest answer is both exciting and careful. Cadbury, they say, clearly was a major stronghold in exactly the period that matters for any historical author. It fits the general picture of a high-status British hill fort in the age of Saxon advance. That makes it a plausible setting for the kind of leader who might later have been remembered as Arthur. But there is no inscription saying, "Arthur lived here." There is no carved sign reading, "Welcome to Camelot." Science can give us evidence, not certainty. Still, visitors climb the hill. Guidebooks begin to mention the connection. The name Camelot appears in brackets on maps. Legend and data walk side by side for a while. Not quite hand in hand, but close enough for people to imagine what it would feel like if they did. Elsewhere, similar processes unfold on different pieces of land. At Tintagel, modern excavations dig below the ruins of the later medieval castle, a building raised by lords who almost certainly knew the Arthur tales and wanted to bask in their glow. Beneath those walls, archaeologists uncover the stone footings of earlier structures, along with more imported pottery from the late Roman and early post-Roman periods. Once again, the picture emerges of an important coastal site, well connected to overseas trade, occupied during the centuries in question. Once again, nothing says Arthur outright, but the place feels, in the mind, suitable, a dramatic cliff, a high-status settlement, a name already woven into Geoffrey of Monmouth's version of the legend. In Shropshire, at Wroxeter, careful digging reveals that parts of the old Roman city were reused in a surprising way. Where once there were neat civic buildings, someone in the 5th century built a big, new timber hall inside the shell of a ruined bath complex. It looks, to modern eyes, as if a post-Roman ruler thought, "I will take this old Roman grandeur and repurpose it into my own seat." Once more, you can see how such a space could match our sense of what an early British Camelot might have looked like. Not a sparkling fantasy city, but a hybrid, half Roman, half new, where a strong man tries to hold together a fragmenting world. Add to this Glastonbury with its claimed grave, Caerleon with its amphitheatre and Roman ruins, Winchester with its painted round table, and smaller hills and earthworks all across Britain, and you start to glimpse the full complexity of the hunt. Camelot is not simply hiding in one place, waiting to be unmasked. It has become a whole network of sites, each with its own claim, each carrying a different facet of the legend. Birth, court, battle, burial. Modern technology deepens this picture. Archaeologists no longer rely only on trowels and good luck. They fly over fields and moors, taking aerial photographs that show faint lines in crops where old walls lie buried. They use ground-penetrating radar to send pulses into the earth and watch how they bounce back, building ghostly blueprints of what lies beneath. They carry magnetometers that can sense tiny changes in the soil's magnetic field caused by ancient fires or ditches. Sometimes the results are dramatic, the outline of a forgotten building glowing under a green pasture like a shadow cast by time. Sometimes they are frustratingly ambiguous. A rectangle seen from the air could be a Roman villa, a medieval farmhouse, a monastery, or, in the wildest part of a historian's imagination, a royal hall. Each time one of these shapes appears near a place already thick with Arthurian associations, the old questions stir again. Is this another piece of the puzzle? Or are we simply drawn to see Arthur wherever we most want him to be? Other sciences have joined the conversation in quieter but equally important ways. Climate studies tell us that the mid-6th century, right in the heart of the vague Arthur time, was marked by strange, difficult years in many parts of the northern hemisphere. Evidence from tree rings, ice cores, and lake sediments suggests that a major volcanic event, or perhaps several, dimmed the sun and cooled the air. Harvests failed. Skies were hazy. Chronicles from different lands speak of famines, disease, and a sense that the world itself was out of balance. If you picture Britain in that era, already shaken by political fragmentation and waves of newcomers, and then add several years of poor weather and hunger, the presence of a capable war leader takes on a new flavor. He is not only a defender against Saxons, he is a symbol of order in a world where even the seasons feel unreliable. Genetic studies on old skeletons add yet another layer. By analyzing ancient DNA from cemeteries, scientists have begun to trace how people moved and mingled in those centuries. The picture is not of a simple, clean replacement. Britons gone, Anglo-Saxons in. Instead, it is a patchwork. Some regions showing more newcomers from across the sea, others holding on to more of the older local ancestry. Many places blending. That pattern fits the idea of a land where alliances and conflicts are shifting, where a leader like Arthur, if he existed, might have commanded a coalition rather than a single neat people. All of this, the digs, the lab work, the remote sensing, runs alongside a constant hum of retellings. Films and television series show Arthur as a grim, mud-spattered warlord in a realistic post-Roman Britain, or as a bright, almost musical king in a fantasy kingdom with shining towers, or as a side character overshadowed by Morgan, Merlin, Guinevere, or the knights. Modern novels reimagine Camelot through the eyes of women, or servants, or enemies, or ordinary people living under its shadow. Some stories strip away magic, trying to tell a plausible Arthur, anchored in archaeology. Others lean fully into enchantment and prophecy. These newer tales shape what people expect to see when they hear that archaeologists have dug at a possible Camelot site. If your favorite film shows Camelot as a sprawling city of white stone, you might feel disappointed standing on a windy hill with only low earth banks and faint post holes. If a novel has persuaded you that Arthur ruled from one specific valley, you may resist any evidence that spreads his world more widely. At the same time, artists and writers often borrow from archaeology to make their imaginations feel more grounded. A director might design Arthur's Hall to match the dimensions of the great timber building at Wroxeter. An author might set a tense council scene at Cadbury, describing the view to Glastonbury Tor as their characters argue. And so the line between research and legend runs both ways. Science feeds story. Story feeds curiosity. Curiosity affects where time and money are spent on further research. If you stretch out on your bed and let all of this drift across your mind, it can feel a little dizzying. A rough war leader in the rain, a Latin chronicler polishing him into a king, French poets adding Camelot and the Round Table, a queen and a knight whose love breaks the court they adore, a last battle at a maybe place called Camelot, a boat sliding toward Avalon, monks with a spade and a lead cross at Glastonbury, a prisoner named Mallory stitching everything into one long English story, Tudor kings repainting a huge round table to link themselves to the legend, Victorian poets and painters gilding the whole scene with rivers and towers and dreamy women in boats, archaeologists kneeling in damp fields, brushing dirt from a shard of imported pottery and thinking, just for a moment, could this be part of it? You might, at this point, feel a natural question forming at the back of your mind. So, what is the truth? Was there a real Arthur? Was there a real Camelot? If you ask careful historians those questions, many of them will smile a little sadly and say something along these lines. There may well have been one or more war leaders in post-Roman Britain whose deeds helped to inspire the Arthur legend. We can see, from texts like Gildas's, that battles like Badon really were remembered. We can see, from archaeology, that there were powerful strongholds, Cadbury, Tintagel, Wroxeter, and others that fit the kind of place a local king might have held. But we cannot tie the name Arthur securely to any one of them. We cannot peel away the layers of story and recover a clean, single, original man. Camelot, likewise, looks most clearly like a literary creation. The name appears in French romances. It arrives into the written record already glowing, already an ideal stage, rather than as a straightforward record of a city. Yet, when you walk the landscape of Britain, you see how quickly stories wrap themselves around real stones, real hills, real rivers. Perhaps that is the deepest truth here. The hunt for Camelot has never been only about finding one lost city. It has been, from the beginning, a way for people to connect their own confusing times to a story about courage, fellowship, and loss. For a monk in Wales facing Saxon neighbours, Arthur was a sign that his people once stood strong. For Geoffrey of Monmouth, he was the pillar of a British history that could rival any on the continent. For French poets, he was the steady centre around which questions of love and honour could spin. For Mallory, writing in prison during Civil War, he was a way to think about loyalty and betrayal. For the Tudors, he was an ancestor whose reflected glory could stabilise a new regime. For the Victorians, he was a lens through which to talk about purity, temptation, and moral failure in an age wrestling with its own uncertainties. For 20th century archaeologists, he was a puzzle, a thread linking high-status sites into a narrative that might make sense of a dark age. For modern readers and viewers, including you, lying here, listening in the half-dark, he can be something softer, a companion at the edge of sleep, a story about how people, in every age, take bits of memory and bits of hope and weave them together into a figure they can follow, or question, or love. If you want a single, neat answer, yes, Arthur lived here, at this exact grid reference, and this is the doorway of Camelot. The legend will disappoint you. It resists being pinned down. Every time someone says, "We've found it," another voice points out other possibilities, other sites, other readings. But if you are willing to let the story remain a little blurred, it can give you something else instead. It can show you how human beings handle the fear that everything is falling apart. We invent a king who held the line. We invent a round table where the strong value each other's voices. We invent a court that fails, but tries to hold itself to higher standards than the rule of the sword. We tell ourselves that such a king might return. We carve his name into hills and paint it on tables and pretend that, under just the right conditions, we could be his companions. As you lie here now, breathing slowly, maybe feeling your limbs grow heavier and softer, you can let Camelot be what it has always really been. Not just a place in a book, not just a hill in Somerset or a ruin in Cornwall, but a meeting point, a crossroads where history, memory, longing, and imagination all sit down together for a moment at the same table. A round table, of course, no seat higher than another, just stories, circling, and you, listening, while the long centuries of rise and fall blur together into a gentle murmur that carries you, step by step, toward sleep. If you are still awake, we can take one more slow walk together, not through the shifting centuries now, but through the world as it is the one you could step into tomorrow, if you wanted to go and look for Arthur with your own 2 feet. Imagine, just for a while, that you decide to follow the threads of the legend across the map. You begin at a hill. It is early morning in Somerset. The air is cool and smells faintly of damp earth and leaves. A thin mist hugs the lower ground, but above it, a long, green shape rises from the fields. Cadbury Castle. From a distance, it looks gentle, almost ordinary, just a swell in the land. Sheep scattered here and there like pale stones. As you get closer, the shape resolves into a series of terraces, banks and ditches curving around the hill, like the marks left by a huge sleeping animal. You find a track and follow it up, step by step, feeling the ground angle under your shoes, listening to your own breath. By the time you reach the top, your heart is beating steadily, not fast, not slow, just calm and strong. The summit opens up into wide grass, a ring of trees at the edges, the sky bigger than it looked from below, Somewhere here, under your feet, people once dug post holes for a great hall. Somewhere here, men and women walked in and out of a wide doorway, carrying food, weapons, messages, gossip. You stand where they would have stood to look out across the land, the patchwork of fields, the glint of water, the distant humps of other hills. On the horizon, you can just make out a lone, narrow cone with a tower on top, Glastonbury Tor. You do not suddenly know that Arthur stood here. No voice whispers his name in your ear. What you feel is something quieter, a sense of layers. You are standing on grass. Beneath the grass is soil. Beneath the soil are traces of walls and posts and hearths. Beneath those, more earth, more stone, more time. You are not the first person to climb this hill looking for a story. You will not be the last. Later that day, you drive across the Somerset levels. Once, much of this land was swampy. Reeds, pools, slow streams, drainage, and centuries of cultivation have tamed it into fields. But the memory of water remains. The road rises and falls gently, then lifts you toward a sharper shape, Glastonbury Tor. You park somewhere below and climb again, this time on a well-marked path, other walkers moving at their own slow pace around you. The wind is stronger here. Grass hisses against itself. A ruined stone tower crowns the top like a crown that has lost its jewels. From here, the view is wider still. You can turn slowly and see the horizon in all directions. Far hills, church towers, highways, the faint line of a river. It is easy to see how, when floodwaters seeped over the low ground centuries ago, this hill might have looked like an island. You can imagine monks in brown robes, moving about the abbey below, telling stories about Avalon and Arthur's grave to visitors whose faces you cannot quite picture. You know, with your waking mind, that their discovery of the king's bones was almost certainly shaped by need. But as you look out, you can still feel how natural it was for people to tie this place to that story. A narrow island of stone in a sea of marsh, an image of Avalon written into the landscape. From Glastonbury, you travel west. The roads grow narrower, the air saltier. The land folds itself into steeper shapes. You find yourself in Cornwall, walking toward the sound of waves. Tintagel. You cross a modern bridge slung high above a gap in the rock, gulls calling, the sea's breath rising from below. On the far side, you climb again, past fragments of walls, grass-grown ruins, paths that end suddenly in empty air where cliff falls to water. The castle here is later than any plausible Arthur. Its broken towers were built by lords who already knew the legend and wanted to wrap themselves in it. But beneath and around these stones, archaeologists have traced older structures. People lived here in the late Roman and early post-Roman period. They traded with far shores. They watched the horizon for ships. You stand close to the cliff's edge and look down at the waves striking black rock. Geoffrey of Monmouth imagined a storm here, a sorcerer disguised, a king's wife tricked, a conception half-born of lies. None of that needs to have happened for the place to carry the feeling of it. The wind tugs at your clothes. The sea fills your ears. You can almost hear the whisper of a line from a story, though you cannot quite make out the words. From Tintagel, you turn inland, across rivers and moors. On Bodmin Moor, if you choose to wander there, you might find yourself facing a rectangle of standing stones, rough, weathered, surrounded by boggy ground. For years, people called this King Arthur's Hall. It looks right for the name. Lonely, heavy, a little eerie under low clouds. Later studies say it is far older than Arthur's supposed time. Neolithic, almost unimaginably ancient. Yet the Arthurian name has carved itself into local memory. Here again, story has reached backwards and draped itself over a structure that belonged to another world entirely. You are not doing archaeology as you walk. You are doing something closer to what countless travelers have done before you. You are letting the names and the legends and the stones overlap, not to fool yourself, but to feel how people before you have tried to link their lives to a past that feels bigger than any one generation. If you had more days, You could keep going to Caerleon in Wales, with its old Roman amphitheatre, where Geoffrey placed Arthur's court, to Wroxeter, where the ghost of a great hall sits in the footprint of an abandoned Roman city, to Winchester, where the vast painted round table still hangs, its timber solid, its surface marked with the names of knights who never actually sat at it, names imagined into being by scribes and painters. You could follow Arthur across half a country like this, tracing a necklace of stones and stories, and at the end of that journey, if someone asked you, "So, where was Camelot?" you might find that your answer has become softer rather than sharper. You might say, Camelot is partly a hall on a hill like Cadbury, partly a dream city of towers beside a river that never quite existed, partly the curve of a wooden table on a wall in Winchester, partly the feeling of standing on Glastonbury Tor in the wind, knowing that monks once told a story here that made strangers cry. Or you might not put it into words at all. You might simply carry the sensation in your body, the way certain places made you slow down, breathe more deeply, feel a small shiver in your chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. Because underneath all the names and debates, the truth with a small t is simple. At some point in that half-dark age, people fought battles that mattered very much to them. Someone or several someones led armies that did not break and run. Their courage, or luck, or shrewd choices left tracks in the memories of those who survived. Those memories were turned into tales. Those tales were turned into legends. Those legends gathered more and more meaning as they passed through different hands. Arthur, Camelot, the Round Table, the Grail, Avalon. These are not coordinates. They are containers. Into them, people have poured their hopes for a just ruler, their fears of betrayal, their questions about love and duty, their longing for a world where strength is used for good. Is there any truth to the Arthur story? Yes, there is truth in the way post-Roman Britain really did tremble on the edge of collapse. Truth in the way a single hard-won victory can live on in the mind of a people for centuries. Truth in the way churches, courts, and later governments have used old heroes to burnish their own power. Truth in the way archaeologists can find a hall in the ruins of a ruined city and say, someone important lived here. They tried to hold on. Truth in the way you, now, many centuries later, can lie in a bed with a small screen glowing softly nearby and feel a little less alone because you are hearing about a king who, in story if not in fact, tried to make the world around him kinder. You do not have to decide which parts of the tale are absolutely factual. You can let them float. You can let Arthur be, at the same time, a hazy war leader in a dim century, a knight in shining mail at a round table, a prisoner's dream of better loyalties, a painted figure on a Victorian canvas, a quiet presence in a sleep story. You can let Camelot be, a hill fort in Somerset, a city of white towers beside an imaginary river, a painted table on a palace wall, a word that, when you hear it, makes you think of fairness, courage, friendship, and the way even the best intentions can sometimes break under strain. As your thoughts slow down, they might begin to feel less like clear sentences and more like the way mist moves across a field, drifting, thinning, coming together again in new shapes. Fragments of what you've heard tonight may rise and sink in that mist. A sword lifting out of a lake. A round table where no one sits above anyone else. A hill that looks like an island when the floods come. A poet in prison with ink on his fingers. An archaeologist brushing soil from a tiny shard of pottery and smiling, just a little. You do not need to hold them all firmly. You can let them pass gently through your mind and then let them go. The story will go on without you. Somewhere, someone else will pick up a book, or click a video, or stand on a windy summit and whisper Arthur's name. Somewhere, a scholar will compare tree rings and chronicle dates, and write a careful article about the probable year of the Battle of Badon. Somewhere, a child will wrap a towel around their shoulders like a cloak, and declare that the couch is Camelot, and that their friends are knights, and that the family cat is a fearsome dragon, that must be appeased with treats. And somewhere, much closer in this room, in this moment, your body knows it is time to rest. Your eyes, if they are still open, can soften now. Your jaw can unclench. Your shoulders can sink a little deeper into the pillow. The rise and fall of your breath can become the only rhythm that matters. In and out, like waves at Tintagel, over and over, in and out, like the wind around Cadbury's hill, circling the summit, in and out, like the centuries around Camelot itself, rising, falling, carrying stories, letting them settle. If a stray thought comes about your day, your plans, your worries, you can imagine placing it at the edge of the round table and watching it sit there quietly while the nights around it grow still and fade. You do not need to solve anything tonight. You do not need to find the real Arthur or pin Camelot to a single dot on the map. You have done enough simply by listening. Now your only task is to drift, to let yourself be carried, as gently as Arthur was carried toward Avalon, into whatever sleep waits for you. Somewhere deep in that sleep, perhaps, there will be a hall, perhaps a table, perhaps the soft murmur of voices you cannot quite make out, or perhaps nothing at all, just quiet, dark, and rest. Either way, it is enough. Let the last of the words thin out now. Let them fall away like footsteps fading down a corridor. The story has taken you as far as it needs to tonight. The rest of the journey is for your dreams. If a little part of you is still awake, we can follow the story just a bit further, not into another century of battles, but into a softer place, where legends don't live on hills or in ruins anymore. They live inside people. Think for a moment about the words that have floated past your ears your whole life. A knight in shining armor, a round table meeting, someone called noble, someone described as having feet of clay. The idea of a quest, whenever a job feels big and difficult. Most of these phrases are not taken directly from dusty chronicles. They come from the echo of stories like Arthur's. When someone says a group sat down at a round table, they don't mean there was actually a circular piece of furniture involved. They mean no one at the head, no one in the shadows. Everyone's voice treated, in theory, as equal. They are reaching, whether they realize it or not, for that old image of Arthur's court trying to tame pride by changing the shape of the furniture. When someone jokes that they are looking for a knight in shining armor, they are pulling, without thinking, on centuries of tales where a lone rider in bright mail appears at the last moment to pull people out of danger. They don't mean they want a literal horse and sword. They mean someone brave, someone kind, someone who shows up. When a company, or a club, or a small group of friends talks about their code, they are doing a quieter version of what Arthur's storytellers did. They are saying, we know the world is messy, we know people are flawed, but we're going to write down, or at least say out loud, the kind of behavior we want to aim for. Bravery, without cruelty. Loyalty, without blind obedience. Honesty, that doesn't forget compassion. Those ideas didn't begin with Camelot, and they certainly didn't end there. But the legend helped give them a shape. Knights, oaths, quests, trials, forgiveness, failure. If you step out of the long corridors of history for a moment and look around at the world you live in now, you can see small, modern reflections of that pattern. A team that sits in a circle instead of rows, so that everyone can see everyone else's face. A community project where people speak up for someone weaker, even when it costs them something. A person who is torn between two promises and is trying, in their own clumsy human way, to keep from hurting anyone. Real life almost never looks as neat as a romance. There are no perfect knights. There are no spotless kings. But some part of us still likes to hold Arthur's court in the back of the mind as a kind of measuring stick, not because we expect to reach it, because it gives us a picture to lean toward. Even our politics borrow the glow sometimes. People talk about a certain government or a certain period of leadership as a new Camelot. They don't mean white towers and wizards. They mean there was a moment, or at least a feeling, that things could be guided by hope and idealism, that power might briefly be used with more grace than usual. Whether that feeling matched reality is another question. Legends don't just describe the world as it is. They show us what people wish it were, and wishes can be very strong. Imagine for a moment that you are not in your room at all, but in a quiet museum somewhere. The lights are low. Your footsteps on the floor make only the faintest sound. You walk into an exhibition with a title like Arthur and Camelot, History and Legend. Behind glass, in a softly lit case, sits a fragment of pottery from Cadbury. The little label says, Rim of a storage jar, Mediterranean import, 5th, 6th century, excavated at Cadbury Castle. To most visitors, it looks like nothing, just a broken curve of clay. But someone with a patient mind can stand there and see in it the outline of a hall on a windy hill, a group of people lifting lids from pots and serving food, a war leader sitting at the far end of the firelit space, listening to reports from the borders. A few steps away, another case holds a replica of the Winchester Round Table. It's smaller than the real one, but still large, painted with names you recognize and some you don't. The label explains that it isn't from Arthur's time, that it was built later, that it was repainted for the Tudors. You read the words, and at the same time, you feel the quiet pressure of the circle itself, the way the eye is drawn around and around, never settling on a single top. A third case holds a page from an old printed copy of Malory's Morted Arthur. The letters are small and dense. You can't read them easily from where you stand, but you know that somewhere on that page, a king is making a hard choice, or a knight is kneeling, or a ship is sliding away into mist. Around you, other visitors move slowly, pausing when something catches their attention. A child is drawn to a model of a knight on a horse. An older woman lingers in front of a painting of the Lady of Shalott in her boat. A couple stands together under a large photograph of Glastonbury Tor at sunset, reading the caption about Arthur's supposed grave. Everyone has brought their own reasons for being here. Some came because they like castles. Some came because they read these stories as children. Some came by accident and are only half listening. But all of them are standing inside the echo of the same legend. The glass, the labels, the careful descriptions are the history side, the feeling that rises quietly in the chest when you see the round table, or the hill, or the boat, is the Camelot side. Even if you have never worn armor, or raised a sword, or sat in a hall full of banners, some part of the legend still belongs to you, because it isn't really about knights. It's about what people do with power, with love, and with fear. Arthur's story, at its softest, asks three questions over and over. What do you do when the world around you is falling apart? What do you do when your ideals clash with your heart? What do you do when something beautiful you helped build starts to crack? Different ages answer in different ways. Medieval writers said, build a court with a code, cling to honor, trust that God will sort the rest. Romantic poets said, look at the nobility, but don't forget how fragile it all is. See the tragedy as well as the glory. Modern storytellers say, people are complicated. Even the best intentions can go wrong. Sometimes there are no perfect answers, only the gentlest ones. You might have your own versions of those questions in your life. Smaller, closer, less dramatic, but just as loud in your head when you lie awake. What do I do when things feel chaotic? How do I keep my promises without tearing myself apart? What do I do when something I hoped would last begins to slip? You are not a king of Britain. You are not riding into Camelot. But the feeling of standing in the middle of a difficult choice, that is something Arthur would recognize. The stories can't tell you exactly what to do, but they can keep you company while you think. They can remind you that people have been wrestling with the same knots for a very, very long time. That no one, not even the most shining knight, ever lived a life without mistakes. Another small thing the stories can offer is this: the reminder that it is all right to rest. So many of Arthur's knights drive themselves to exhaustion. They ride until their horses drop. They fight until they bleed. They force themselves to stay awake through storms and dangers in order to prove their worth. And yet, the storytellers always make time, in the rhythm of the tale, for nights by the fire, for quiet meals, for moments of confession in chapels, for sleep. No one can be in armor all the time, not even in legend. If there is a little voice inside you that says you should always be working, always be fixing something, always holding everything together, you can imagine sitting that voice gently down at the round table for a moment. Let it listen to how tired even the bravest knights sound when they finally admit to themselves or to a friend that they cannot carry everything alone. Arthur himself needed companions. He needed Merlin for wisdom, Guinevere for grace, his knights for strength, his people for purpose. He was never meant, even in imagination, to hold the whole of Britain on his shoulders without help. You are allowed to set things down for the night. You are allowed to let go of the day's quests, the small ones and the big ones, and pick them up again tomorrow. Or not at all. Imagine, just for a moment, that your bed is its own kind of safe hall. Not flashy, no banners, no stone arches, just a quiet, soft, ordinary place where you are not required to be clever or brave or productive. You do not have to be anyone's hero here. You do not have to solve the riddle of Camelot. You do not have to decide which hill is the real one. You can simply exist, breathing slowly, muscles unwinding, thoughts drifting. If any stubborn worry insists on climbing up beside you, you can picture yourself gently placing it on an empty chair at that imaginary round table and saying, "Wait here. I will come back to you another time. Tonight, I'm leaving the hall." Then stand up, in your mind. Step away from the table. Walk through a quiet doorway and close it softly behind you. Outside, there is only night. No battle, no court, just the dark sky, the distant sound of waves, or wind in the trees, or city hum, whatever is natural where you are. In some versions of the legend, Arthur is not dead. He is only sleeping, somewhere beyond the edge of the map, until he is needed. You can borrow that idea for yourself, in a kinder way. You are not doing nothing when you sleep. You are not failing. You are resting in your own Avalon, a place where your mind and body can heal, where your old battles can be laid down for a while. Tomorrow, if you are needed, you will wake. You will lift your small sword, your words, your choices, your work, and step back into your own version of the story. But not now. Now, your only task is to drift, to let your breathing find its slow, natural pace, to feel the weight of the blanket like a gentle hand across your shoulders, to feel the mattress supporting all of you at once, the way the land once supported Arthur's hall on Cadbury's hill. If your thoughts try to pull you into another chapter, you can smile at them and say, "The story will still be there when I wake up. Arthur isn't going anywhere. Camelot will still be shining in the distance. The hills will still be here. But tonight, I am going to sleep." And then you can let the images blur. Hills, halls, tables, towers, boats, mist, all softening, all sliding gently away like a boat into fog, until there is nothing left at all but the quiet rise and fall of your breath. In and out, in and out. If you'd like to wander further through other legends on another night, we can. For now, it is enough. Let the last of your waking thoughts sink, like a sword returning to still water. Let the surface close, and let yourself go with it. Down, down, into deep, restful sleep. If you're still here, still hovering at the edge of sleep, we can walk one last, slow circle around this legend, together. Not to add more dates or more hills on the map, just to look gently at one question from a few different sides. What does it really mean when we ask, is there any truth to the story of King Arthur? You can imagine, if you like, 3 people listening to that question. They're not from the same time, they're not in the same room, but we can visit them, one by one. First, picture a modern historian. They're sitting at a desk late at night. Around them, shelves full of books lean in like quiet listeners. On the table there are open pages, Latin chronicles, translations, dense articles with small notes. At the bottom of each page, they have a mug of something half-finished, gone lukewarm. Their eyes move line by line through an old text. A sermon by Gildas, a list of battles, a Welsh poem. They circle words with a pencil. They jot down dates. They map names from the page onto an atlas, rivers, towns, hill forts. When they hear the word truth, they think of evidence. What can be dated? What can be cross-checked? What can be supported by things we can touch? Pottery shards, layers of soil, tree rings, coins. For them, the true part of the Arthur story is something narrow but solid, that Britain really did go through a hard, chaotic time after Rome withdrew, that battles were fought, that someone, or several someones, resisted the advance of new powers, that later writers remembered a war leader and slid his name into the empty space left by older, more vague accounts. For the historian, this is enough. They close a book, make a note, and are quietly satisfied by that small island of certainty in a sea of story. Now let the historian's lamp fade to a dim glow and turn your attention to a second person, a storyteller. They might be a medieval poet at a long-ago court, or a modern writer staring at a laptop screen in a cluttered room. It doesn't really matter. They are hunched forward, elbows on the table, eyes unfocused, seeing something that isn't literally there. In their mind, a whole slowly takes shape, not a specific one, a blend. A little of Cadbury's height, a little of Caerleon's Roman bones, a little of Tennyson's towers, a little of Glastonbury's outline at dusk. They see a long table, with faces around it, some clear, some hazy. Arthur, tired, but steady. Guinevere, watchful. Lancelot, restless. Gawain, thoughtful. A dozen others, whose names come and go. For this storyteller, when they ask, what's true? They're not thinking about radiocarbon dates. They're thinking about the weight of feelings. Is it true that people can love two people at once and tear themselves in half? Yes. Is it true that loyalty can clash with desire? Yes. Is it true that you can try, with all your heart, to build something fair and it can still crack from the inside? Yes. Their truth lives in scenes where someone hesitates at a doorway, or kneels with their forehead touching cold stone, or rides out alone into the rain knowing they might not come back. Those moments are real to them in a different way. Even if Arthur never lived in exactly the way the story tells it, the emotions are honest. They are simply dressed in armor and cloaks instead of modern clothes. The storyteller's satisfaction comes not from proving that Camelot stood on this or that hill, but from the quiet click inside when a scene feels right, when a character's choice hurts just enough to be believable. Now let that image soften too. The poet's laptop screen dims. The quill is set down. The words on the page blur. There is a third person we can visit, much younger, a child, anywhere in the world. Maybe sitting on a carpet with toys scattered around. Maybe on a bed with a book open. Pictures of knights and dragons and a wide round table. They do not care very much where Camelot really was. They do not care whether the pottery at Tintagel is late Roman or early medieval. Their truth is even simpler. There was a place where the good people sat together and tried to do the right thing. There was a king who was brave and kind. There were friends who swore to help each other. Some of them failed. Some of them did wrong and were forgiven. Some of them never came back from their quests. But for a while, at least, there was a circle where being noble mattered more than being selfish. As they play, the child might make the table out of whatever is at hand, blocks, cushions, the edge of the bed. They assign roles without fuss. You're the king. You're the knight. I'm the wizard. They speak in present tense. Arthur is not dead for them. Camelot is not ruined. It's all happening right here, right now, on the floor, with a plastic sword and a stuffed dragon and laughter. If you ask that child, is any of this true? They might look puzzled for a moment, and then say something like, "It's true in the game," and for them, in that moment, that's enough. 3 people, same legend, 3 different kinds of truth. Factual truth, emotional truth, playful truth. None of them cancels the others out. They sit side by side, like 3 different cups on the same table. You can pick up whichever one you need in a particular moment. You, lying here now, are maybe a little like all 3. There are times in your life when you want the historian's world. Clear facts, solid ground, dates that line up. There are times when you need the storyteller's world. Rich images, feelings explored safely, patterns that make your own emotions less lonely. And there are times when it helps to touch the child's world again. Simple games, simple roles, a sense of safety in pretending to be braver than you feel. The Arthur story offers a hand to each of these parts of you. If the part of you that loves facts wants something, it can hold on to this. There was a real, difficult period in Britain's history when people fought very hard not to be swept away. That struggle left marks in texts, in hills, in bones, in pollen, in tree rings. The story of Arthur is one way that struggle stayed alive in memory. If the part of you that feels too much needs something, it can hold on to this. People have always wrestled with complicated loves, torn loyalties, fierce hopes, crushing disappointments. Arthur, Guinevere, Lancelot. They are like mirrors tilted at different angles. You can see flashes of your own questions in them and realize you aren't strange for having them. If the part of you that is tired and just wants a gentle place to rest needs something, it can hold on to this. There is a hall in your imagination, no rent, no deadlines, no alarms, where you can sit down among people who, in story if not in fact, are trying their best to be decent in a rough world. You can visit that hall any time, for a little while, and then leave again when you've had enough. You do not have to solve the mystery of Arthur to be allowed in. You do not have to be pure or perfect. You just have to sit and breathe. If you like, we can take one last little journey there before the night takes over. Close your eyes, if they're not closed already. Imagine that you are walking down a corridor, lit by soft, flickering light. The walls are not any particular color. They are more like memory than stone. You hear the low murmur of voices ahead. You push open a heavy door and step into a hall. It is a blend of every version of Camelot you've ever heard. A bit of timber from Cadbury, a bit of Roman arch from Caerleon, a hint of Tennyson's river outside, a tapestry you might have seen in a painting, a round table shaped something like the one at Winchester. Faces are turned toward you. Not all noble, not all beautiful, just human. Some young, some lined, some in armor, some in plain clothes. One of them, at the far side, might be Arthur. He doesn't look exactly like any actor or picture. In fact, his features shift a little if you try to stare too hard. What feels solid is not his cheekbones, or his hair, or his eyes. It's the sense that this is someone trying to hold things together. Someone tired, with more questions than answers, who still gets up in the morning and does what he can. You move around the edge of the room until you find an empty place at the table. No one stops you. No one asks for proof that you belong there. You sit down. Somewhere to your left, 2 knights are arguing in hushed tones about a quest. Somewhere to your right, someone is laughing quietly at a joke you didn't hear. Arthur is talking to someone else, not to you. He doesn't need to. It is enough to be here, to feel the circle closed. You can imagine that on the wood in front of you, there is a small cup. It's filled with whatever kind of truth you need tonight. It might be clear water, simple facts, cool and refreshing. It might be something warmer, a story that makes you feel understood, even if it never literally happened. It might be something invisible, the sense of being safe for a few minutes, known by no one, and yet accepted anyway. You lift the cup, you drink. No one pays much attention. They are used to strangers coming and going. The hall has been here a very long time. When you set the cup back down, your eyelids feel a little heavier. The voices around you blur. Someone at the far end of the table is speaking maybe about old battles, or about the future, or about nothing in particular. You catch only fragments. Held the line. Winter was long that year. We did what we could. We tried. You feel the bench under you become softer. The table, the hall, the people all begin to fade like mist when the sun rises. You are lying in your own bed again. Your own room, your own breathing. Slow and quiet. The legend has done what it can for tonight. It has offered you its questions and its comforts, and then let you go. If you find yourself still thinking about Arthur tomorrow, wondering again about battles and hills and graves, you can always come back and walk through the story in a sharper light. Ask for maps. Ask for dates. Ask for arguments between scholars. If you find yourself needing the emotional side again, you can come back to the love triangle, the round table, the grail. If you just need a gentle place to rest, you know where the corridor is now. You can follow it back to that hall in your imagination any time. Sit down for a few breaths, and then leave again. For now, though, the best thing you can do for yourself, for your tired mind, for your body that has carried you through another day, is to stop asking anything at all. To let the questions about truth and legend and where and when settle slowly to the bottom of your thoughts like snowflakes in a shaken globe. Watch them drift down, 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 until everything is still. Above that quiet, your breath moves steadily, in and out, like waves, like wind in old trees, like the rise and fall of centuries themselves. Arthur, somewhere in story, is sleeping. Camelot, somewhere in story, is silent. The halls are dark. The torches are out. The round table is just a circle in the dimness. Nothing is demanded of you there. Nothing is demanded of you here. You can join that sleep now, deep and easy. No quests, no battles, just the long, restful night. By now, the night outside your window has probably settled into its quietest hour. Lights are off in most of the rooms around you. Screens dim. Even the city, if you live in one, sounds a little more distant than usual. If you are still here, still listening, still hovering at the soft edge of sleep, we can let the story unfurl just a little more. Not with new facts, not with more arguments about hills and dates, just with one long, slow picture you can drift inside. Imagine that everything we've talked about tonight has folded itself into a single landscape, a kind of dream Britain. The sky is a deep, velvety blue, not quite black, scattered with stars that seem closer than usual, as if they are listening too. There is a path in front of you. It is narrow, but easy. You do not need shoes. You do not need armor. You only need to walk. The path begins on a hillside. The grass here is short and soft, silvered with dew that glows faintly in the starlight. You look around and realize you are standing where Cadbury's hall once stood in some age of story. But tonight, there is no timber, no smoke, no shouting, no clash of cups. The hill is empty, quiet. The only sound is the low whisper of the wind moving over the earthworks. Old banks and ditches, now just gentle ribs under the grass. You walk toward the edge and look out. The fields below are dark squares and long, dim stripes. Here and there, a farmhouse window shines yellow for a moment and then goes dark. Far away, you see a thin line of moving lights. A modern road, but up here, the centuries feel very close together. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost hear hooves, voices, the crackle of a fire in a long-vanished hall. When you open them, there is only the present, your own breath, steady and slow. A faint track leads down the side of the hill. You follow it. Your steps make almost no sound. The air is cool against your face, like water. At the bottom, the path becomes a lane. Hedges rise on either side, dark shapes against the sky. Somewhere beyond them, an owl calls once and then is quiet. You walk for a while like this, between hedges, under stars, until the land opens and flattens. This is the Somerset Plain, wide, low, full of invisible ditches and streams. In your dream night, the ground is firm, but you can feel, under everything, the memory of older wetlands, the way water used to spread here, turning hills into islands. Ahead, one such island lifts itself out of the flat land, Glastonbury Tor. In the starlight, it is just a dark triangle, with a notch of tower at the top, like a thumbprint pressed gently onto the sky. You do not have to climb it, unless you want to. Just looking is enough. You stand at the foot of the slope and let your eyes trace the curve upward. Long ago, people said that Avalon lay somewhere out in this watery world. Later, they said that Arthur's grave was discovered here. Tonight, the hill doesn't say yes or no. It simply rests where it has always been, rising from the plain, carrying its stories lightly. You breathe in, you breathe out. For a moment, the tower at the top seems to glimmer. Maybe that's your imagination. Maybe it's just a star passing behind a thin cloud. Either way, it's gentle. The path bends again. You follow it as it turns west. Now you are walking along the edge of something broader, deeper. The smell of salt touches the air. The wind feels different, carrying the long, slow rhythm of waves. Before you realize it, the land has lifted, narrowed, become rock. There is a bridge, slim and high, leading from one piece of stone to another over a dark cut of water. This is Tintagel, but emptied of tourists and guards and daytime noise. The only sounds now are the sea and the faint creak of the bridge. You step onto it. Beneath you, water moves in and out of the cliffs, restless but somehow soothing, like the breath of a sleeping creature far too large and far too old to wake. On the far side, ruined walls stand like teeth along the edges of the headland. They are not Arthur's walls. Not really. They belong to other centuries. But in this blended landscape of memory and myth, they are allowed to stand in for every hall and fortress that has ever carried his name. You walk between them. There is no danger here, no slippery path, no risk of falling, only the impression of height and space, and the sea stretched out in all directions, its surface catching starlight in countless small ripples. You find a place to sit on a low stone, looking out. If you turn your head just a little, you can see, far inland, the silhouette of the Tor. Farther still, the smooth lump of Cadbury. It is as if all the Arthur places have drawn closer together for one night, flattened onto a single horizon, so that you can see them all at once. They are quiet, no banners, no armies, just shapes against the sky. Behind you, in your imagination, there is a faint sound of hooves on stone. You don't have to turn to know who it might be. Arthur, perhaps, or one of his knights, or no one at all. Just the echo of stories. If you like, you can picture a small group of riders moving slowly along the cliff path, not in bright colors, not in clanking armor, just tired figures in plain cloaks, talking softly among themselves. They are not going to war. They are returning from one. Their shoulders are relaxed. Their weapons are sheathed. They are thinking, as you are, of rest. For a moment, one of them, perhaps the king, perhaps not, stops near where you're sitting and looks out over the same dark sea. You don't see his face clearly. You only sense something like recognition, as if he knows that you, too, belong to a time that feels confusing and heavy sometimes, as if he knows how tiring it is to try to be good in a world that often rewards the opposite. He does not speak. There is no need. After a moment, he inclines his head the slightest bit a nod, almost too small to notice, and rides on. The hooves fade. The headland is empty again. You sit for a little longer. The sea keeps breathing. In and out. Waves curve in. Foam lifts and falls. In and out. When you stand, you feel even lighter than before, as if you have put something down on this rock, some old weight you were carrying without realizing it. The path from Tintagel doesn't take you back the way you came. Dream paths rarely do. Instead, it follows the coastline for a while, then melts inland, crossing fields that are only half there, flickering between now and a dozen different thens. You pass, without stopping, close to the faint shadow of a Roman city with a wooden hall in its heart. You pass the rectangle of standing stones on a moor, the so-called King Arthur's Hall, now clearly ancient and silent, its true makers, long forgotten, its borrowed name, slipping away like a story told in the wrong century. Each time you draw level with one of these places, you feel a little tug, an invitation to go closer, to investigate. But tonight, you don't need more answers. You have heard enough. You let them drift past, like islands glimpsed from a ship. After a while, the path leaves the land entirely. In your mind's eye, you are standing now not on cliffs or hills, but on a small wooden jetty at the edge of a still lake. The water is dark but calm, like polished stone. The stars above are reflected in it, as if there is another sky below your feet. There is a boat tied to the post beside you. Simple, plain, just big enough for one person to lie down in comfortably. You know this place without needing to be told its name. Lakes like this appear in Arthur's story over and over. A sword rises from them, a hand in silk. A boat carries a wounded king away toward a hidden island. Tonight, the lake is offering you something gentler. Rest. You step into the boat. It does not rock or lurch. It holds you easily. There is a folded cloak in the bottom. Soft, light, warm. You lie down and pull it over you. The wood under your back is smooth. The line tying the boat to the post loosens all by itself. You begin to drift. There is no need for oars, no need for steering. The boat knows where to go. You do not see Avalon ahead of you. You do not need to. Wherever this small craft carries you across the dark, star-filled water is exactly where you need to be for the hours of night that remain. You can feel each gentle sway as it moves, left and right, forward and forward. The shore slips away. The last outlines of hills, Cadbury, Glastonbury, the Cornish cliffs shrink and soften and finally merge into a single dark line on the horizon. Even the tower on the Tor is gone now. Above you, the sky is wide and mild. Below you, the lake is steady and deep. You are, for this moment, held perfectly between them, like a thought held gently between two breaths. In and out. Your body in the real world is lying in its own boat. Your bed, your couch, your chosen place of rest. The blanket across you is its own kind of cloak. The walls around you are your quiet lake shore. Nothing is demanded of you right now. No decision, no bravery, no effort. The quest is over for tonight. The court is sleeping. The arguments have faded. Even the archaeologists have put down their tools and gone home. The hills are dark and still. The round tables, painted or imagined, are empty for a few hours. All of Arthur's scattered truths, the historical, the emotional, the playful, have curled up where they belong, in books and stones and people's hearts. You do not have to carry any of them. You can let the boat carry you instead. If any thought intrudes a worry, a regret, a plan, you can picture it as a knight on the shore, calling to you from far away. They want you to come back and solve something, to take up some armor, to ride out once more. You can raise one hand, just slightly, from under the cloak and wave to them. A promise. I'll come back and deal with you another time, but not now. Tonight, I am already on the water. The boat moves farther out. The knight on the shore becomes a tiny figure, then just a suggestion, then nothing at all. Soon, the only things left are the quiet, the steady rocking of the hull, the weight of the cloak, the slow, easy rhythm of your breathing. In and out, in and out. Somewhere, far beyond your senses, stories are still moving. Historians are still arguing. Writers are still drafting. Children are still playing with plastic swords. King Arthur is still riding across some invisible border between fact and dream. Camelot is still shining faintly in the collective imagination, a place no one can quite find, and no one really wants to lose. All of that can continue without you for a while. You have given the legend your attention, your curiosity, your patience. Now, it gives you something back, permission to rest. Let your jaw loosen. Let your shoulders sink. Let the small muscles in your hands, your feet, your face slacken, as if they, too, are tired knights finally taking off their armor after a long day. If your eyes are still open, let them close now, gently. If they are already closed, let them grow heavier. Low thoughts may continue to drift past for a little while, like lights on a distant shore. You do not have to chase them or push them away. You can watch them from your small boat, calm, already halfway to sleep. Before long, perhaps sooner than you expect, even those thoughts will thin and stretch and dissolve into dreams. Maybe those dreams will carry you back to hills and halls. Maybe they will go somewhere completely different. Either way, you will be moving through a night that belongs entirely to you. Safe, unhurried, quiet. The truth about Arthur and Camelot can wait. The next chapter, the next story, the next question, all of that can come another day. For now, the only story that matters is this one. You, floating slowly into deep, healing sleep. You, wrapped. You, carried. You, at rest.